This is a story about a girl who wasn't anything special, just nice and friendly to everyone around her. She always had a smile on her face, and she never ever turned down a request. Even if it meant she had to pick up the slack herself, just to please others. She knew people were taking advantage, but she preferred that to being hated. To escape reality, she played her favorite autumn game, Celestial Marriage. It's about a heroine with sacred Florence power who saves the world. This character always triumphs over her evil rival, Annalise. Florence is loved by a prince and a knight, and she's surrounded by people who are always ready to protect her. Playing Celestial Marriage, our girl also dreamed of being loved and having someone make her happy. But those dreams apparently weren't meant to come true in this life, because one day, on her way home from work, she was hit by a truck speeding down the road. The last thing she thought was, "I don't want to die." Then, in a flash, she realized she wasn't lying on the pavement anymore. She was running. It was hard to run, and when she looked down, she saw she was wearing this weird long dress. She looked around and recognized the courtyard, and that world tree in the distance, its glow lighting up the dark sky. But the second she figured out where she was, someone grabbed her arm. She screamed, and the next thing she knew, a sharp sword ran right through her chest. The guy who stabbed her was stoked he finally caught Annalise, that witch messing up people's lives with magic. Yeah, after dying in the real world, she ended up in the marriage in the heavens world. She was stuck in the body of the villain, Annalise, who was destined to bite the dust no matter what. Bleeding out on the rose bushes, she thought again about how she didn't want to die, and why things had to go down like this. The heroine closed her eyes, then suddenly snapped them open to find herself in a completely different place. She was lying on a soft bed in a lavishly decorated room, totally lost and confused about what was going on. A maid entered the bedroom and announced that the girl's father wanted to see her in the hall. As they dressed her, she tried to figure out how this was even possible, since just a couple of minutes ago, Annalise had been taken care of. No sooner had she stepped into Count Neumann's presence than he started berating her for being late. Even though this guy hadn't shown up in the game, this was pretty much how the heroine pictured him. The Count held out some papers to the girl, ordered her to sign them, and hand them to the butler. Turns out it was an invitation to the Celestial Festival. This festival was held once every 300 years, and Annalise knew that the game's main character was destined to be chosen as the Lunar Maiden there. The Count told his daughter not to worry, since the Prime Minister and the church had already been compensated. When Annalise heard about it, she asked if it was a bribe, and that just set the guy off. He threw the wine glass he was holding, and it shattered into a million pieces. The Count told Annalise to stop overthinking things, since it didn't suit her, and just do as she was told. He declared that a daughter of the Neumann family couldn't be worse than the others, and absolutely had to become the Lunar Maiden. Hearing her father tell her, as a final word, that she was worthless and couldn't afford to fail, the girl left the hall. She knew perfectly well that no matter how hard she tried, and no matter how much money was thrown around, Florence would be the Lunar Maiden. From the very beginning of the game, Annalise always seemed like a nasty piece of work, a real villain. But seeing the powerful and terrifying Count Neumann, the main character understood why she'd become so bitter. And not only was this girl never going to beat Florence, she was also definitely going to get offed, one way or another. One thing was clear, the game world she loved was a total nightmare for Annalise. You know, back in her previous life, the girl could never say no to anyone either, and just silently put up with all the crap. But now, our girl's decided things are gonna be different from now on, and she ain't taking it anymore. Annalise is gonna live selfishly and only for herself. The capital of the empire was the city of Himmeriken, blessed by the light of the world tree. Once every 300 years, a saint was chosen there, and she was called the Lunar Maiden. By forming an alliance with the tree, this maiden must fulfill just one wish of someone who is pure of heart. Today's the day of the Celestial Festival, where Florence will be chosen as the Lunar Maiden, and this is the opening scene in the game. But unlike the original story, our heroine was dead set on ditching the whole villainous episode. Passers-by, seeing Annalise Neumann on the street, pretended not to notice her. They knew that if you started talking to her, you'd be up to your neck in trouble later. The heroine knew Annalise's family was hated because of Count Neumann's power and influence. That guy used every trick in the book to get what he wanted, from greasing palms to straight-up bullying. Figuring Florence had this in the bag, she trashed the invitation. And first things first, she had to ditch this villainous image. The MC announced the event was starting and asked all the candidates to head into the hall. The heroine looked around, anticipating her first meeting with the main character. In the game, Annalise's arrogance immediately put her in the rival's corner. She probably bribed someone back then, on her dad's orders, so it's no wonder she was so sure she'd win. And after not getting the victory she expected, the girl felt the burn of humiliation. Just as the heroine was mulling all this over, someone bumped into her from behind. Annalise turned around and saw Florence, who apologized for being so clumsy. The girl seemed incredibly sweet, and she was really happy to see her in person. The main character remembered that she needed to make a good impression on Florence. After all, this girl would become a person with significant influence on world events, someone everyone would accept and love for her kindness. Florence smiled, introduced herself to Annalise, and, mentioning she was a candidate, suggested they head into the hall together. The main character replied that she wasn't participating in the festival, but was happy to keep her company and support her in the competition. Just then, two boys ran past them, one of them holding a glass of juice. He didn't see the girls standing in the way and bumped right into Annalise. People around froze in fear. Seeing that the kid had stained Lady Newman's dress, the boy's mother immediately rushed over and started apologizing, begging her to have mercy on the offender. She was ready to take the punishment for her son, anything to shield him from Annalise's wrath. In that moment, she fully grasped the kind of reality she'd landed in, inhabiting this character's body. And even though everyone in the original story feared and loathed Annalise, she decided to change that. The girl crouched down in front of the boy and gently asked if he was hurt. Then, to the surprise of the surrounding ladies, Lady Neumann offered to buy him a new juice instead of the one he spilled. Florence rushed to Annalise, gushing over her kindness, but Annalise modestly replied that she was embarrassing her. Suddenly, Prince Klaus appeared, demanding to know what all the commotion in the square was about. She instantly recognized him. In the original game, he was Florence's love interest, the one who offed Annalise. He was a total looker, a fan-favorite character, and basically the root of all Annalise's troubles. The prince approached her and asked why she was standing there, looking like she didn't appreciate the attention. Out of nowhere, he started accusing Annalise of upsetting the kids at the festival. He capped it off by calling her a trashy little rich girl who only gets by on her dad's power and looks down on everyone else. The heroine instantly recognized those lines. They were exactly what Klaus said to Annalise in the game. Fear gripped her at the thought that no matter how hard she tries, history's gonna repeat itself. But then, Florence jumped in, stepped forward, and told the prince he had it all wrong. She explained that Annalise is actually really sweet and was just worried about the kid. The people standing nearby backed her up, saying they saw with their own eyes that the kid just took a tumble. The heroine was stoked. Not only did she dodge a bullet, but she realized she actually can change the future. She genuinely thanked Florence for sticking up for her. She truly seemed like a saint. Klaus stared intently at the girl he'd never seen before and asked, "Who the hell are you?" When Florence introduced herself, he told her to hurry to the hall so she wouldn't be late. Just then, Annalise noticed Klaus's affection meter on his chest, just like in the game, spiking for Florence. But when the prince turned to her to ask what Neumann was doing there, the meter immediately tanked to rock bottom. Clearly, Klaus's affection for Annalise was just unachievable. But Florence came to the rescue again, taking her arm and introducing her as a friend who came to support her. She was shocked. Just a little while ago, she was desperate, and now she had a friend in the main character of her favorite game. There was no more doubt. Now she was sure everything would be all right. Annalise wouldn't become the villain, and she'd live a happy life. Even so, the prince was convinced Neumann was wearing a mask, and he intended to tear it off and protect the moonlit girl at any cost. After the festival, the heroine decided to take a walk and enjoy the world of her favorite game. Downtown was pretty busy, and she even found streets she hadn't seen while playing Celestial Marriage. Florence rushed up to Annalise and apologized for making her wait. Lady Neumann replied that she was just so excited for their meeting that she arrived early. She invited Florence to their family's tailor so he could make her a dress. The girl blushed, feeling awkward about accepting such a gift. Originally, there was a scene where Annalise mocked the innocent country bumpkin's clothes at the palace party. This caused a huge uproar among high society, and you could say that's when the whole city started to hate Neumann. Since the heroine now needed to avoid that, she decided to give Florence this gift as thanks for her help back then. And even though the girl insisted she hadn't done anything special, Annalise still managed to convince her to go into the tailor's shop. Florence confessed she was really scared of not making any friends in the capital and thanked Lady Neumann for her kindness. The heroine was so touched by her cuteness that she ordered all the best dresses to be brought, promising to buy them all. Actually, it was the most fun she'd had in ages, because she'd never gone shopping with friends before. The old her always just blended into the background. Even when the group was taking a picture, she'd give up her spot and take the photo for everyone else. She tried to be helpful, but honestly, she was just a nobody to them. But things were different now. She'd managed to become friends with Florence, and all that was left was to get closer to the other characters at the ball. Night had already fallen, and carriages were arriving at the Imperial Palace for His Majesty's birthday, but one of them suddenly lost a wheel. The man in the cloak was trying to fix the breakdown as quickly as possible, but his master wasn't too worried, since now he had an excuse to be late to the party. Just then, Annalise was passing by, and, seeing that someone was in trouble, she got out to help. Learning that the man was also going to the ball, she offered him a ride in her carriage so they could get there together. And even though the big guy clearly wasn't thrilled to be there, his assistant was super grateful for the lady's help. The dude dressed in all black was giving off some seriously weird vibes, and she wondered why the emperor even invited him. Sitting in the carriage, Annalise sized up the tall stranger, whose face looked pissed even behind that mask. The second she tried to strike up a conversation, he cut her off cold, saying he wasn't in the mood for chit-chat. Once she got to the palace, she was still fuming about that guy's rudeness. She was racking her brain, trying to remember if that character was even in the game. Suddenly, someone called out to Annalise from behind, chuckling that she was, as usual, ticked off at someone. Turning around, she saw two characters she knew from the game, the knight Elgar and the sorcerer Franz. She was blown away to see them in the flesh, and she could barely contain her excitement. Elgar reminded her that she was there for the emperor's birthday and told her to try and keep it classy. And Franz, for his part, told Annalise not to even think about making fun of the Moon Maiden. The heroine thought the wizard was looking for a fight, but trying to keep her cool, she replied that it hadn't even crossed her mind. To Franz's surprise, the girl said that she and Florence were good friends, and she had even picked out the dress for her herself. These words caught the attention of the other guests, who were shocked that Lady Neumann had actually made a friend. The heroine was pleased to hear the nobles discussing how the dress that the earl's daughter personally picked out for the Moon Maiden was sure to be magnificent. Just then, it was announced that Lady Florence had arrived at the palace, and Elgar ordered her to be invited inside. However, when the girl entered the hall, the smug grin on Annalise's face vanished instantly. Florence stood before everyone, still wearing her old simple dress. The heroine rushed over to her to find out where her new dress was, and if something had happened to it. Florence confessed that the dress was so extravagant that she just got super anxious and was too afraid to wear it. Meanwhile, the aristocrats around them were already whispering about how basic Annalise's dress choice was for her friend, clearly trying to make her look bad in front of everyone. The heroine tried to defend herself, explaining that she actually picked out a nice, expensive dress. But Elgar cut her off, saying that a person's worth isn't defined by what they're wearing. So, despite Annalise's attempts to change things, she heard that line from the game again, coming from the knight. And if things keep going this way, she's gonna get offed again, just like the villain. When a pure-hearted saint appears in the capital, once every 300 years, they call her the Moon Maiden, and she can show people the path to true happiness. But you gotta be careful, because the brighter the light, the darker the shadows, and this world was no different. Horrible monsters controlled by demons lurked in the shadows of those lands. And to stay alive, you absolutely couldn't give in to their persuasion. Annalise gave Florence the dress, hoping to change her fate, but things didn't go as planned. Prince Klaus strolled over to Elgar to find out what all the commotion was in the ballroom. And when the knight claimed that Lady Annalise had ruined the Moon Maiden's evening, the heroine couldn't take it anymore and yelled that it wasn't true. The girl couldn't believe that everyone actually thought she'd deliberately bought Florence a bad dress. She tried to explain to the prince, saying she really did buy a beautiful dress, but Florence was just too embarrassed to wear it. But Klaus didn't even seem to hear her, assuming Annalise was just trying to make fun of the girl's appearance. And there it was again, the line from the original story. It suddenly dawned on her that all the characters were only speaking lines from the game, and no matter how hard she tried, the future couldn't be changed. The prince grabbed Annalise's arm and, declaring she didn't belong there, told her to get out. The heroine was already bracing herself to be kicked out of the ball, just like in the original, but suddenly, the guy in black she'd given a ride to the palace blocked their path. Turns out, this man was a duke, whom Klaus asked to step aside with a smile. The guy didn't budge, just asked why he needed to move. Klaus explained he had to get the girl out of there, surprised the duke hadn't seen the mess she made. The man's response, he suddenly declared that maybe the prince should be tossed out too, and along with him, he pointed at Elgar and Florence, saying they were acting out of line as well. The prince gritted his teeth, furious that the duke was suggesting they all leave the hall. But the duke kept going, saying he'd only come because he couldn't refuse the emperor's invite, and he'd be happy to help wrap things up for the night. Even though the guy was kinda weird, Annalise now thought he wasn't as bad as she'd first figured. The guests started whispering about what the Duke of the Borderlands thought he was doing. The Emperor's cocky nephew, Mr. Helmut Weissman, was royal family, but rarely showed his face in public. The prince couldn't just kick him out, even though the guests would have loved it, since they'd all heard about the Duke's unconventional pets. The nobles didn't want to be anywhere near a guy who, rumor had it, was snatching people up left and right. The heroine started racking her brain, remembering a character in the game who sounded like the Demon Lord, but they kept his face hidden. It was pretty clear the capital's residents were scared stiff of the Duke. Annalise went up to him to thank him, but Florence suddenly cut her off. She apologized to Lady Neumann for causing so much trouble and making such a scene. Klaus and Elgar jumped right in, tripping over themselves to say Florence hadn't done anything wrong, and Annalise was the only problem. Still, the knight wasn't about to miss the chance to say he respected this amazing girl's honesty. Just then, both Klaus and Elgar's affection level for Florence went up again. That was the heroine's charm, the thing everyone loves about her. Florence walked over to Weissman and said she was really happy to meet the Duke, but he told the girl not to talk nonsense, because no one in their right mind would be happy to meet a strange man. Florence even flinched at such rudeness, and Annalise immediately ran to her side. She told the girl not to take Helmut's words to heart, because when she first talked to him, he answered her the same way. After all, if Annalise hadn't helped the Duke on the road, he wouldn't have even made it to this event. She noticed that even though the male character's words and actions in the game hadn't changed, the Duke showed no affection for Florence. And that meant there were also those who weren't following the preset script. It suddenly occurred to the heroine that if she got close to Weissman, maybe a future where she stayed alive would appear. And then His Majesty appeared in the banquet hall, and everyone began to congratulate him on his birthday. The Emperor thanked the guests for coming to his celebration. He was looking forward to a good evening, because even his unsociable nephew had decided to show up and grace them with his presence. Annalise was subtly watching the Duke, trying to figure out how to connect with a guy who'd even turned down Florence. Meanwhile, the Emperor walked up to Helmut and started teasing him about how a grown-ass member of the family was still single. According to His Majesty, starting with Klaus, the younger members of the imperial family have a tough time with courtship and marriage. Not being able to take any more of that, the Duke told his uncle that if he'd invited him just to lecture him, he'd rather leave. Everyone around was shocked at how disrespectfully Weissman was talking to the Emperor. His Majesty sighed with disappointment and admitted he'd hoped to find a bride for his nephew at the ball, but it was clearly a lost cause. Suddenly, Annalise stepped forward, grabbed the Duke's arm, and announced that she would be a candidate to be his bride. The second she said that, she got a notification from the game that an unknown episode had been unlocked. Annalise had a chance to change the course of the story, and she wasn't about to let that opportunity slip away. But then, the Duke suddenly snapped back that he refused. The heroine wasn't about to give up that easily, so she asked the guy, who was a total stranger, to at least hear her out. She claimed she'd never even been near the border and would love to check it out. Annalise knew she couldn't stay in the capital, or she'd be toast, so she figured she'd head to a place that wasn't even in the story. But the Duke shoved her away and told her to leave him alone. The heroine kept pushing, saying she was a great cook and would clean his house. Helmut cut her off and told her to stop, because he wasn't about to bring strangers into his home. Annalise was desperately trying to think of something else, anything, as fast as she could, because her life was on the line. And just then, the Emperor walked up to her and asked if Miss Neumann was really sure about her decision. He said his nephew was a bit of an oddball and had been keeping to himself since his mother passed away. The imperial family couldn't even dream of Helmut marrying some aristocrat. The Duke tried to cut the conversation short, not wanting to drag it out any longer. But the Emperor wasn't happy about the unflattering rumors swirling around their family because of his nephew's reclusive nature. And since Helmut had already been sidelined from diplomatic duties as a member of the ruling family, His Majesty insisted he listen up. The Emperor issued a formal decree. The Duke would accept Miss Annalise Neumann as his bride. Of course, he understood the young lady's feelings might change, so he suggested the couple live together for 6 months first. Hearing this, the heroine was over the moon with joy. The World Tree ceremony was supposed to happen during those 6 months, wrapping up the game's storyline. And this gave Annalise a chance to safely experience everything that was coming. After the ball ended, the Duke's assistant informed Miss Neumann that they would be expecting her the next day. Meanwhile, Helmut sat in his carriage, impatiently waiting for them to finally get moving. Even though the Duke was a total grump, the heroine was just glad to ditch the main storyline. The girl was sure she could pull this off, and besides, with his personality, she wouldn't feel bad breaking off the engagement later. Annalise barely said goodbye to the servant before Florence rushed over, totally shocked about the sudden engagement. The girl said she was super worried about her friend because the Duke seemed really shady. Florence suddenly started crying and added that she'd be so lonely when Annalise moved so far away. The heroine promised to visit the capital sometimes because she really wanted to get closer to her. A smile immediately lit up the girl's face. Annalise was sure that if everything went well over the next 6 months, they could live a fun life in this world, like besties. With growing confidence that she would definitely survive, the heroine said goodbye and got into the carriage. When Florence, still stunned that Annalise was leaving the capital, was left alone, a small yellow bird landed on her shoulder. The girl was baffled why Neumann acted that way. She'd even worn an ugly dress on purpose to look perfect next to the villainess, but Neumann had ruined all her plans. The next day, the heroine set off for the Duke's estate, her path leading through a really dense forest. It had been more than half an hour since she left, and this forest just seemed to go on forever. When Annalise's father found out she was marrying the Duke, he was really surprised at first. But then he was happy and let her go without a second thought. The girl, of course, felt bad that she had to leave Florence without really getting close to her. But her would-be assassins were in the capital, and that was way more important. In the original game, the story ended in 6 months at the ceremony by the World Tree. Annalise just had to survive until the finale, and then her life would be saved. When the heroine arrived at the castle, she was blown away by its size. The Duke's assistant, Schlert, who the girl already knew, came out to greet her. Right behind him was the Duke himself, and instead of a greeting, he just flat out said Annalise wasn't welcome here. With the sun setting in an hour, he told her she should head back right away if she planned on making it back at all. But our girl was standing her ground. No way she was turning back. Helmut knew she'd heard all the rumors swirling about him in the Empire. Of course, Annalise knew perfectly well she was facing the terrifying Duke, the one who commanded those things. But she told him she wasn't scared of him at all and asked him to stop trying to kick her out because it was rude. Helmut never thought any woman would ever want to come to his lands, so he asked what she was up to. The heroine realized she needed to apologize for imposing on him, since she understood her visit was causing a problem. She bowed and, because of certain circumstances, asked him to let her stay in the duchy until the World Tree ceremony. Schlerte was bummed that Miss Annalise apparently wasn't actually planning on marrying the Duke, but Helmut wasn't surprised at all, since he figured from the start that losing the Moon Maiden title was just too humiliating for the Count's daughter. When he said that, the main character noticed his affection for her plummet to like rock bottom. She'd never seen a rating that low in this game, ever. Since the Duke was gonna dump Annalise soon anyway, he let her do whatever she wanted, as long as she didn't get in his way. As a final word, he told her not to even think about going into the garden on a moonlit night. Helmut headed into the castle and called Schlurth after him, leaving the girl alone. Before the main character could even figure out what to do, she suddenly realized her suitcase was gone. Annalise only managed to see someone hurrying around the corner. Freaked out, but trying to keep it together, the girl followed the stranger and ended up inside the estate. The conversation with the Duke left a bad taste in her mouth. Even Klaus, who hated Annalise, only registered a 0 on the likes her scale, but Helmut, he was in the negative numbers. It's weird he even has that scale, considering he's not even the main character. Spotting her suitcase near one of the doors, Annalise figured that room must be hers. Meanwhile, the servant reported to the master that he'd shown the lady to her room and asked where to serve dinner. The Duke dropped the act and ordered the food be taken to the girl's room, and to make damn sure she didn't cross his path. Waking up in the morning, Annalise was surprised to find breakfast on the table, since she had no idea who brought it. It was the same thing last night. Hearing birds chirping in the distance, the girl went to the window. The room was quiet, but the heroine was used to eating alone. When she first started working at the company, she wanted to stand out, so she even stayed and worked through her lunch break. After that, she stopped getting invited to lunch with the others, and eating alone just became her normal thing. All she wanted was for people to like her, but they just started using her as a doormat. Even though Annalise was used to being alone, she suddenly got bored and decided to explore the place she'd ended up in. The main character stepped outside, blown away by the sheer size of the Duke's palace. Since yesterday, she hadn't run into the Duke or his assistant even once. Rounding a corner and figuring there'd be a garden, Annalise suddenly heard a scream. A kid was hiding in the bushes, with a huge splinter stuck in his hand. Even though the kid told her to stay away, Annalise rushed over anyway. He'd run into a sharp branch and hurt his arm, so she told him he should see a healer. The kid mumbled at her to butt out and that he could handle it himself, since nobody around here uses light magic. According to the game's story, the main characters had elemental magic. Klaus, for example, could control water, and the others fire and wind. Florence had a healing talent. They called it light magic, but Annalise's power was darkness, a destructive force that could even nullify light magic. The heroine suddenly realized she could help the kid and grabbed his hand. Using her destructive magic, she incinerated the splinter, and it literally vanished from the wound. Annalise was super happy that she managed to help the boy using dark magic, which, as it turned out, could also be useful. The boy took off his cap and thanked her for the help. At that moment, the girl noticed his ears, pointed at the tips. The boy got worried and asked her not to get the wrong idea. He rushed to explain that he wasn't a monster, just a demon. He said that he possessed magical power and looked different from humans, but didn't attack people like a monster would. The boy begged her not to be scared, but Annalise wasn't scared at all. Instead, she thought he was incredibly cute. The girl was surprised how small the demon was, and she compared his ears to those of a fairy from a fairy tale. The kid said his grandpa was right. The lady is weird, 'cause people usually freak out and attack demons. Everyone else just sees them as monsters. No different. The boy suddenly went quiet, then sadly added that his mom was mistaken for a monster too, and they killed her. The heroine felt terrible hearing that, but she noticed the story was similar to her own power, which wasn't what it seemed. People are just brutal, and they don't even try to understand anyone who's different. Suddenly, the boy grinned and said that the Duke, unlike everyone else, is totally different. Annalise was surprised to hear that Helmut Weissman was kind and protected them. After dinner, the heroine was thinking that if the rest of her days were this chill, she might actually make it to the end of the story. Turns out the kid who took her suitcase and brought her food was that same boy, and his name was Ortho. He blew off dinner with Annalise, and since she was feeling bummed, she decided to head out for a walk. Through the window, she saw this unbelievably gorgeous moon, like it was shining way brighter in this world. When she stepped out into the courtyard and looked up again, she suddenly spotted someone on the roof of one of the towers. The second he turned towards her, and she saw a beast's face instead of his, Annalise remembered he told her not to go out on moonlit nights. Before she could even blink, the creature leaped off the tower and landed right in front of her. The heroine jumped, not believing her eyes, because there was a straight-up monster standing there. The beast started snarling like crazy, and Annalise started shaking with fear, thinking she'd really messed up. But now that he was closer, she suddenly realized that the monster's clothes and hair looked super familiar. The heroine recognized the Duke in the monster, and his pointed ears twitched at that moment. Remembering Ortho's words, Annalise realized the Duke wasn't just protecting demons, he was one. The girl sighed in relief, smiled, and calmly asked him not to scare her like that again. Helmut suddenly froze in surprise, and asked why she calmed down when she realized who was standing in front of her. The heroine told him how she learned from Ortho about the oppression of demons. The Duke was even more surprised to learn that the boy had spoken to Annalise. According to the girl, Ortho told her how demons are attacked by humans, and she added that she wouldn't do that herself. She smiled again and quickly assured the Duke that she wasn't someone to be afraid of. Claiming that things weren't as she imagined, Helmut turned away from Annalise. He said that he was only half a demon, and while he usually ate human food, in this form, moonlight became his source of sustenance. That's exactly why the Duke told the girl not to go outside on a moonlit night. He thought Annalise would be scared and run away, but she turned out to be much braver. Helmut was actually surprised to see someone react like that to a guy like him. And then, out of nowhere, she tells him they're kind of alike. The Duke looked at her, confused, but she decided to keep the whole different world thing to herself. Annalise's magic was darkness, the kind that makes flowers wither, not bloom. She told the Duke how often people had told her she was pure trouble. But still, today, she'd managed to pull that branch out of Ortho's hand with her magic. So, Annalise figured judging someone and being scared of them just because of how they look is pretty messed up. The next morning, Ortho set up breakfast in the dining room. The heroine was surprised she'd been invited to join the Duke, too. The boys served the master's favorite cheesy omelet. Annalise tried the breakfast, and it tasted unbelievably delicious to her. Silent Helmut suddenly spoke up, saying he was glad she enjoyed the meal. The heroine, who always ate in silence and alone, was suddenly so touched that she even cried. And when the Duke tried to find out what was wrong, she smiled and thanked him for the opportunity to have breakfast together. Suddenly, a servant entered the dining room and announced that guests from the capital had arrived for Lady Annalise. When the heroine went out into the courtyard, she saw Florence on the doorstep. The girl said she was really worried about her friend and also brought her a letter from His Majesty. The Emperor felt Annalise's engagement to his nephew was shaky and decided it was best for her to return to the capital. And since the Duke himself was originally against the marriage, Florence came to take her friend away. As the girl took the heroine's arm, she realized with horror that everything had been for nothing. The Duke would have kicked her out anyway, and now they'll drag her back to the capital to, well, you know. Tears welled up in Annalise's eyes, and then she suddenly heard Helmut's voice. He put his hand on the girl's shoulder, yanked her from the clutching hands of a shocked Florence, and declared he wasn't having it. Pulling Annalise close, the man added that things were going great between them, and there was no need to worry about the engagement. Trying not to show how surprised she was, Florence reminded the Duke that he had been against all of this. However, Helmut replied that he didn't give a damn about what happened before, and right now this girl was his fiancée. And even if the engagement were to somehow fall through, it would only be by their choice, and nobody else needed to stick their nose in it. Florence tried to object again, but the Duke cut her off sharply. In his usual blunt way, he stated that he hadn't given outsiders the right to speak. Helmut told the woman to leave, and he wasn't about to say it twice. Florence stepped closer to Annalise and asked if the Duke was threatening her. She said the girl shouldn't put up with it, since the engagement was going to be broken off in 6 months anyway. After stating she really wanted Annalise to return to the capital and that she wasn't going to back down, Florence finally left. Watching her go, the heroine thought that she still hadn't managed to properly talk to her friend, who had come because she was worried about her. She decided to send Florence a letter of apology later. The Duke let go of Annalise's shoulder, which he was still holding, and suggested they go back inside. But suddenly, the girl felt dizzy and grabbed his arm. The heroine apologized and explained that she was probably just a little too stressed. In reality, Annalise felt the icy grip of dread again because of the possibility of returning to the capital. When they got back to the palace, the Duke asked why the girl was so scared when her friend arrived, since she didn't even react like that to him. That's when Annalise confessed that if she went back to the capital, her life would be in danger. She smiled and thanked the Duke for protecting her, and even though he wanted her to leave, he still helped her stay. She thanked him sincerely again and admitted that he was the first person who'd ever supported her like that. With that, she pressed against his chest and started crying. Besides everything else, Helmut was the first man to offer her his shoulder, and she'd never experienced anything like it. The Duke, looking at her, wondered why she'd suddenly gone so quiet, and even thought she might be faking it to catch him off guard. Suddenly, she could feel how hot Helmut's hand was. She exclaimed that he had a fever, ignoring his attempts to tell her he was fine. She'd heard that the Duke rarely saw a doctor, but this was too much, so she immediately started trying to get him to lie down on the couch. Helmut was really surprised that Annalise was worried about him. The heroine, for her part, was just blown away by the nonsense he was spouting. Then the Duke explained that this was his normal body temperature, totally standard for demons. He turned away and told Annalise to get off him if she understood. But the girl wasn't going anywhere, because she was curious about what else made demons different from regular people. Helmut asked why she was so interested, and if she was trying to find his Achilles heel. Annalise was actually offended that he would think that about her. The Duke apologized if he came off harsh, but he just wanted to be clear. And when he stared intently at her, the girl suddenly noticed the color of his eyes. Since she'd already seen it anyway, Helmut took off his mask. The heroine saw a really handsome guy, with one gray eye and one yellow eye. She wasn't just blown away by how hot he was, but also that the Duke was way younger than she expected. Because she was totally speechless, Helmut figured she was disgusted by his mismatched eyes. But Annalise explained that wasn't it at all, and she was just surprised he wasn't as ancient as she thought. She said the Duke always acted so stuck up that his age was hard to guess behind the mask, but she didn't mean anything bad by it. The girl, on the contrary, didn't get why he was hiding such awesome eyes. Those words threw Helmut back to his childhood, when his mom asked him the same thing. She didn't understand why he hid his beautiful eyes, and he'd say it was because other kids said they were hideous. The Duke explained to Annalise how the demonic blood affected his body, including his eyes. People were afraid that his gaze could bring bad luck, so he tried to keep them covered. And to avoid freaking people out, Helmut wore a mask, even in his own palace, when others were around. Annalise lifted the mask and apologized for him having to wear it because of her, but added that his eyes didn't scare her. The girl confessed that she didn't want to be a burden to the Duke. She smiled and promised to return to the capital in 6 months, when things changed, and until then, asked him to let her stay with him. Later, lying on her bed, Annalise remembered the day and how scared she'd been that morning. Of course, she was happy that Florence wanted her back, but if that happened, the story could get back on track. The heroine was really glad that the Duke protected her, and she didn't have to leave. Besides, he called Florence an outsider, and it was weird that Annalise was even having dinner with Helmut now, who was originally against strangers in his house. The heroine dreamily wondered if this meant the Duke no longer considered her a stranger. But what surprised the girl most about the day was just how damn good-looking Helmut actually is. The Duke might have been rough around the edges, but he wasn't a bad guy, and honestly, he was pretty normal. She even thought he was better looking than the main characters. And even though he hadn't done anything wrong, he lived like a hermit. Mom found Helmut sitting on the stairs, looking super bummed about something. The kid hated the capital. He wanted to go home and play with the monsters in the woods. He never wanted to come back here, ever, because he couldn't stand people. Out of everyone in the whole damn world, Helmut only loved his mom. Demons never gave him any trouble, but people always called him an outsider and weakling. Mom stroked his hair and explained that he was part human too, and she wanted him to make friends with his own kind. She was sure that someday someone would notice his beautiful eyes, and she told him not to shut his heart off. But the day Helmut stood over his murdered mother's body, he knew he could never trust people. The kid was bawling, blaming himself for everything that happened, saying he was an idiot for trusting them. The Duke stood by the window, watching the sunset, lost in his memories. He couldn't shake Annalise's words from his mind about how beautiful his eyes were. That morning, the heroine sipped her tea, replaying everything she'd learned about the Duke the night before. Suddenly, a cheerful ortho burst into the room, suggesting they go berry picking in the woods. The girl was so surprised she choked on her tea, but after calming down, she asked the boy to give her time to change. Annalise got ready quickly, thinking that a walk with the Duke wouldn't be so bad. At breakfast that morning, Helmut dropped the facade, and she was happy that he was starting to trust her. Rushing outside after ortho, the girl bumped into the Duke and realized she still wasn't used to how handsome he was. The boy brought a basket for the lady, and Helmut figured out they were heading to the woods. Knowing he was right, he stared so intensely at the girl that she started to feel uneasy. And while she was trying to figure out what was going on, the Duke walked up to her, touched her hair, and said it would be better to braid it before going into the woods. With those words, he took the tie from around his neck and used it to tie up Annalise's hair. The girl thanked him, but without a word, he turned and headed back towards the manor. She was incredibly flustered. It was the first time Helmut had ever called her by her name. While walking through the forest, Ortho admitted that he was very happy that the lady had become friends with the master. Annalise thought to herself that this kid was pretty kind too. The girl told Ortho that she thought it was too early to pick berries, since there were only leaves everywhere. The boy smiled, reached out his hands, and the trees lit up with magical light. She couldn't believe her eyes. In the blink of an eye, berries had suddenly ripened on the branches. Annalise was blown away by the magic, and Ortho explained that his tree demon powers came from his grandpa. He said if you ask plants nicely, they'll give you berries. Plus, turns out demons have magic from other elements too. Annalise smiled and told the kid that demons seemed like fairies to her, and now she totally gets how different they are from monsters. Ortho told her that demons live in harmony with nature, but humans use nature's power like a tool for magic. On the other hand, there are monsters that harm this world, and they're not connected to other living things by nature at all. But for some reason, people saw demons as the same kind of monsters and thought they were inferior beings. They wiped them out just like monsters, hunting them down. The girl remembered that monster hunts were a huge event in the game. The main character would choose a companion to build a relationship with. Annalise, remembering the game episode where Florence suggested Klaus go to the Eastern Lake, asked Ortho if that's where the monster hunt was happening. The kid was totally caught off guard by that question. He told Annalise that there weren't any monsters at the Eastern Lake because that's where the village of friendly water spirits lived. Remembering how Klaus went there to hunt in the original game, the heroine bolted towards the Duke like a shot. She warned him about an imminent attack on the spirit village, which needed saving. Helmut and his assistant were both stunned by what they were hearing and asked Annalise to repeat herself. Ortho explained that the lady had heard in the capital that the prince was planning to turn the village near the lake into a hunting ground, all for the sake of hunting monsters. Schlert was floored, because the water spirits were peaceful creatures, completely harmless to people. Annalise explained that they were just picking an easy target to test the power of the Moon Maiden. When she played Celestial Marriage, the girl really enjoyed interacting with all the characters. Working together with Florence and Klaus, she wiped out demons without a second thought. And even though she didn't think it was a big deal back then, turns out the heroes ended up taking out Ortho's mom and friends because of it. After hearing Annalise's words, the Duke decided to head to the Eastern Lake and warn the demons to lay low. And just then, Schlert suddenly yelled out because he spotted the prince's carriage in the distance. It was clear the hunt was already on. The Duke said they were in deep trouble, since the demons' territory was huge, not just near the lake, but also spread out across the surrounding plains and swamps. To get the word out to everyone in time, Schlert suggested splitting up and covering 4 different areas. The biggest settlement was past the bridge near the lake, but there were plenty of residents in the smaller villages too. Since there were 4 of them, Annalise suggested they get moving, ASAP. The Duke was surprised she was planning on going to help too. Even in the carriage, he was still scratching his head about her decision to come with them, especially since she was hiding from those city slickers back at the duchy. In the original game, Florence got separated from the group during the hunt because of Annalise's screw-up. That's when it became clear Annalise was out to make the main character's life a living hell, any way she could. Naturally, after that, everyone saw her as the enemy, and things went downhill fast. Truthfully, she really wanted to avoid this whole meeting, but she felt like going was her responsibility. The Duke just couldn't wrap his head around why Annalise was so concerned about demons, being just a regular human. But the main character didn't see any real difference between them. Ortho told her that demons were actually good people. Good demons. And even if there were some differences between them and humans, Annalise was sure they had a lot in common, and they should get to know each other better. She tried to convince Helmut that she wanted to help, and it wasn't for any selfish reason. We decided to ditch the carriage by the river once we got there. Schlert, Ortho, and Helmut headed for those hard-to-reach settlements, while Annalise was sent towards the lake. They promised they'd link up with her as soon as they were done with their assignments. When our girl was just playing the game, she figured she had to stick to the storyline, no matter what. But now it hit her. If Florence offed innocent people and found out about it later, she'd be absolutely devastated. Annalise approached the bridge, determined to put a stop to this, whatever it took. She barely set foot on the bridge when someone suddenly called out to her from behind. Our girl turned around and saw Florence and Klaus standing there, looking totally caught off guard. Annalise was super happy to see her friend and immediately rushed over to her. She begged them to hear her out and explained that these parts weren't crawling with monsters, but peaceful demons. Annalise begged him not to kill them, saying they were totally harmless. Klaus asked if that was true, his face showing doubt about the need for the hunt. At that moment, the heroine had hope that she had managed to save the demons from destruction. But Florence suddenly declared it was a lie, and that Annalise was making it all up. Rushing up to the prince, she told him not to let Lady Neumann fool him. Not believing her ears, Annalise exclaimed that she wasn't lying. But Florence, as if hypnotizing Klaus with her innocent gaze, kept insisting that she trusted his judgment. She claimed he was doing the right thing, because protecting people and eliminating monsters was the prince's true duty. As if spellbound, Klaus repeated her words about him doing the right thing. Annalise rushed to Florence, begging her to believe they were making a huge mistake, but the girl's next words stopped her dead in her tracks. Florence whispered to Annalise, "So what if demons are safe? People don't just catch the fish that could hurt them, they also kill livestock for food." According to her, people only live because the imperial family slays all sorts of monsters. Annalise hadn't given up hope of convincing Florence that demons and humans are very similar and begged her to just talk to them to understand. But suddenly, Klaus chimed in, suspecting Neumann was up to something again, daring to defend those creatures. He remembered how the girl decided to marry the Duke, who, as rumor has it, controls monsters. From all this, the prince concluded that Annalise and Helmut were plotting a rebellion against the imperial family. Just as the heroine, insulted by such words, tried to object, Florence suddenly cried out. She grabbed her arm, complaining about how much it hurt. The heroine didn't even see it coming, didn't realize when Florence bumped into her. Klaus instantly rushed over to see if the girl was okay, but she just turned around, smirked, and told Annalise to chill out. And while the girl was trying to figure out what just happened, the prince yelled at her not to even think about going near Florence. No matter how much the heroine tried to convince him she didn't do anything, and they just bumped, he wasn't buying it. Klaus was convinced Annalise was using some kind of messed up dark magic that drains the life out of everything. He straight up said that even monsters weren't as bad as Neumann. Florence told the prince to not sweat it, saying that even if Annalise did have dark magic, she could use light magic too. The heroine had no clue she possessed such a messed up power, something that could suck the life out of people. Still, she kept insisting that she hadn't hurt anyone. Hearing that, Klaus ordered Annalise to swear, right then and there, that she'd only use that power to protect people. And together, they'll be wiping out monsters for the sake of humanity. He told the girl to join them, if she even considered herself human. The heroine tried to explain again that the demons were innocent, but Klaus cut her off. He pointed his sword at Annalise and declared her an enemy of the Empire, since she was planning to help those creatures. The heroine knew that standing up for what's right at this moment was basically a death sentence, but she wasn't backing down. She tried again to get through to Florence, begging her to think about what she was saying, but all Florence did was tell Annalise to stop it, because she was the villain, and she should act like it. In that moment, the heroine finally realized that Florence had been doing all of this on purpose the whole time. Repeating his order not to approach Florence, Klaus lunged at Anneliese with his sword. But just then, the Duke suddenly appeared, pulled the girl close, and shielded her with his cloak. Through gritted teeth, Helmut demanded to know how Klaus dared raise a hand to his fiancée. He wanted to know if the prince could justify his actions to the emperor. Then, the Duke pulled Anneliese closer and told her not to be afraid, that everything was all right. The heroine gazed at the man with admiration, who had saved her once again and taken her side yet again. Klaus admitted drawing his sword was an overreaction, but Anneliese refused to participate in the monster hunt. He was about to say something else, but suddenly someone appeared on the other side of the bridge. There stood several demon children, drawn by the noise to see what was happening. Spotting Lord Helmut among the humans on the other side of the bridge, they waved their hands in cheerful greeting. The Duke shouted for them not to approach, since there was an imperial squad nearby. The heroine realized these were water demons, who looked nothing like they did in the game and were eerily human-like. Seeing the monsters practically hand themselves over, the prince raised his weapon again. Anneliese jumped in, trying to convince him they weren't the kind of monsters that attack, and they even looked like people. Florence had been silently watching the whole time as the girl tried to talk Klaus out of killing the demons. But suddenly, she spoke again, her voice all dreamy, claiming that even if they looked human, they weren't really people. Under Florence's spell, the prince agreed with her. He ordered his unit to ignore everything and keep moving forward. Glancing quickly at the Duke, Anneliese decided to use her magic and raised her hand. An inky black fog of dark magic swirled up in front of the unit, blocking the soldiers' path to the bridge. The knights were confused, not understanding what was happening or why they couldn't see anything. Meanwhile, Anneliese and the Duke were already running across the bridge towards the lakeside settlement. One of the knights yelled at Florence to use her light magic. The girl raised her hands, and her magic lit everything up around them. Florence shouted that Anneliese was lying, and they shouldn't let her fool them. The prince no longer doubted that the rumors about the Duke were true. Together with Anneliese's magic, they could become a real headache for the Empire. Klaus promised to let them off easy and forget the whole thing if they agreed to surrender. To prove their innocence, Helmut and Anneliese had to hand over those creatures. But the heroine yelled that she refused, and she didn't give a damn about his opinion because the demons hadn't done anything wrong. She declared she wasn't going to sell out her principles just to save her own skin. The girl decided that if they didn't believe her, she had no other choice, and she grabbed the rope that served as a railing on the bridge. Convinced she was the only one who could protect these innocent creatures, Anneliese instantly used dark magic to obliterate the bridge. Those left on the other side announced the hunt would have to be called off. Klaus declared he wouldn't let this slide because it was an offense against the Empire. And Florence, for her part, told Anneliese to remember she's the villain and she can't escape her destiny. As a final threat, the prince promised to report the incident to the emperor himself. Watching them go, the heroine thought about how there's no real justice in this world, and Florence's opinion is all that matters. After the squad left, the locals came out to thank the Duke. Helmut advised the demons, for their own safety, not to rebuild the bridge just yet. According to Schlert, there had been cases before where demons wandering into human territories were mistaken for monsters, but this attack was going too far. So the Duke promised to discuss this at a meeting with the Emperor and try to bring these lands under control to prevent it from happening again. Helmut caught Anneliese giving him a surprised look. When he asked what was up, she said he was a real jerk at the ball, but suddenly, he's all sweetness and light when talking to demons. Even though Helmut was a half-blood, you could tell just by looking at him how much he disliked humans. The heroine was curious what the reason could be for his animosity. The demon kids ran up to Anneliese and thanked her for protecting them. As a thank you for saving them, they gave her pearls from their lake. The elder tried to explain to the kids that Lady Anneliese was an aristocrat, and such a simple gift was beneath her. But to everyone's surprise, the girl happily accepted the gift, genuinely amazed that they'd gotten it straight from the lake. Anneliese thanked them for the pearls and promised to treasure them. When she took the shell, she noticed her hands were completely covered in soot. And out of nowhere, the Duke wraps his arms around Anneliese from behind, takes her hands in his, and promises to make her any freaking jewelry she wants out of pearls. This girl gets reborn as the villainess in a world where the main character's opinion is all that matters. And yeah, she's bummed, because the game turned out to be a real drag compared to what she thought. Even so, she ended up smack dab in the world of her favorite game, Celestial Wedding, a game about a heroine who feels everyone's pain, and all the folks around her who love her back. On the way to the castle, the Duke asks Anneliese why she doesn't want to go back to the capital. Now, he's totally convinced she's dreading meeting the prince and the others. She admits he's right and begs him to keep it on the down low. Helmut promises to protect Annalise and tells her she's got nothing to sweat. Her cheeks flush red because he called her by her first name again when he said that. When the Duke helped the heroine out of the carriage, she was surprised by his sudden change of heart. Ortho, who was running past them, chuckled, pointing out that the master was always kind. Annalise watched in surprise as Helmut affectionately patted the boy on the head. At their first meeting, the heroine thought the Duke was a conceited and unpleasant guy. Because of his status, she imagined him much older, but the face beneath the mask was nothing like she'd pictured. Annalise was curious about who he really was, and she wanted to know more about this man. As the girl said goodbye to Schlert and Ortho, the Duke suddenly called out to her. The heroine was once again surprised that he suddenly started calling her by her name, like he was starting to trust her more. Helmut walked up to Annalise and said that she had really helped the water demons out today. Then he paused briefly and, looking away, added that she was something else. Since the girl was from another world, she panicked for a second, thinking the Duke had figured everything out. But Helmut just kept talking, saying he used to think everyone was a liar. The prince gave Annalise a chance to keep her status if she stopped helping the demons, but she chose the water people over her own safety. The Duke thought she was after resources, status in the capital, or something like that. And yet, even with his special sight, Helmut couldn't detect any lies in Annalise's words. Turns out that was his demonic power, kind of like a sixth sense. With his golden eye, the Duke could see people's evil intentions. Their words and actions could be totally deceptive, and Helmut saw a black cloud around most people. But he could only see deliberate evil that way. The cloud wouldn't appear around someone who genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. After all this, the Duke didn't care if he was being fooled, because he knew you couldn't trust people anyway. Even though his eyes were hidden behind a mask, he kept putting his faith in this power. When Annalise defended the demons, she wasn't doing it for personal gain, and Helmut admitted he hadn't seen that in a long time. Figuring the girl must be tired, he told her to get some rest and promised he'd be late to breakfast the next day. Watching him go, she couldn't help but think about how kind he really was. Helmut learned early on that people are full of it and just live by their biases. 15 years ago, all the nobles were buzzing about the Emperor Helga's eldest daughter visiting the capital. The gossips whispered that Lady Helga had a child with something unnatural. When the boy entered the palace, the chatter died down. The kid looked pretty normal, and the aristocrats were surprised that such a union could produce regular children. Helga was the emperor's eldest daughter, and she fell for his dad, who happened to be a demon. Their love was a no-go, and when the empire's knights raided the forests hunting for the princess, Helmut's father vanished. The young mother and her baby hid out in the borderlands, and later, her younger brother became emperor. He adored Helga, and he started inviting her and her son to the capital to smooth things over. Helmut didn't like the people in the palace, and he tried his best to avoid those visits. Mom explained that she didn't love the place either, but she thought it was wrong to live as hermits their whole lives. She wanted her son to make friends, but he didn't get why he needed them when he was already friends with tons of demons. Helga believed the boy needed human friends, and she hoped he'd learn to trust and care for others. One day, while he was hanging out with some other kids in the courtyard, they asked him if it was true they kept monsters at home. Helmut explained that it was just him and his mom, so they got help from demons, who were different from monsters. The kids got curious and wanted to check it out. Looking closely at their faces, Helmut didn't see any bad intentions, so he told them that demons were hanging out near the palace, at the shoe factory by the woods. Hearing that, the boys immediately ran off to tell their dads the news. Helmut tried to stop them, but they weren't listening, and after that, his memory gets fuzzy. Next thing he knew, the guards showed up, and he was just a helpless kid in front of them. Helmut called for his mom, but she didn't answer or show up. In all the chaos, the emperor lost sight of Helga too, and nobody knew where she was. But Helmut didn't have time to look for his mom, because the guys at the factory were in danger. That night, there was a full blue moon over the city. When the kid got to the factory, the knights standing there were bragging about their pretty good haul. Some of their uniforms were splattered with the blood of the demons they'd wasted. Rushing into the factory, Helmut was horrified to find the bodies of his loved ones lying on the floor. He couldn't figure out why he hadn't seen that dark haze around those guys. He didn't even sense any evil intentions coming from the blood-soaked guards. So the whole thing just didn't compute for the kid. Why did this all happen? Finally, it hit him. People didn't hate demons. They didn't even see them as equals. They were just targets to be wiped out, and that was their idea of justice. As Helmut took a few more steps forward, a bone-chilling dread ran down his spine. There on the ground, in a pool of blood, was his mom, clearly taken out by mistake along with the demons. Tears of regret streamed from Helmut's eyes. He blamed himself for trusting the humans. The Duke was asleep, dreaming he was a little kid again, standing in a field full of flowers. He was looking everywhere for his mom, but instead, a girl with long lavender hair showed up and asked what was wrong. Seeing her, Helmut immediately hid his eye, the one that looked different. The girl got worried and asked if something hurt. Noticing the color of his eyes, she was genuinely amazed and asked why he was hiding them. Smiling brightly, the girl offered to help Helmut look for his mom. Then he hung his head and confessed that she had passed away. Helmut explained that his people were hated and persecuted, and one day he'd get strong enough to protect everyone. He suddenly stopped, realizing that she was also human. But to his surprise, the girl suddenly declared that she'd protect everyone with him. Helmut woke up and sat up in bed, replaying her last words in his head. He went to the window and saw it wasn't morning yet, still dark outside. Then he spotted Anneliese down by the fountain. The Duke threw on some clothes and hurried down to find out what was up, why she was out so late. The girl smiled and explained she'd woken up in the middle of the night, couldn't get back to sleep, and decided to take a walk. Then, after a pause, she added that Klaus had told her the day before that her magic was a force that could destroy everything, and that she herself was a blight on the world. The heroine couldn't shake the feeling that she was playing the villain here, and there was nothing she could do to change it, no matter how hard she tried. The girl confessed to the Duke that she really liked Florence, who was sweet and kind. Everyone loved her, and Anneliese wanted to be just like her. Catching herself, the heroine added that, even so, she was glad they managed to save the water demons. Helmut countered that no one is born inherently good or evil. Therefore, justice is relative and depends on your perspective. Anneliese understood that herself, but it still troubled her to think about it. On the other hand, she actually felt much better after talking with the Duke. After all, he promised to protect her, and when you have someone to lean on, problems seem smaller, so she was glad he was there. Suddenly, Helmut stated that in his opinion, Anneliese was unlikely to ever be as beloved as the Moon Maiden. Hearing those words, she was indignant, because she already knew that, and he didn't need to say it out loud. But then the Duke smiled and added that she should stay, because here she could live in peace and safety. The heroine was happy to hear that she didn't have to fear being kicked out anymore, and she thanked Helmut for that. The sun began to peek over the horizon, and Anneliese asked the Duke why he himself had woken up so early, and if he'd had a bad dream. Helmut confirmed her hunch, saying he'd seen her in his dream. She replied that if she was in it, then it definitely couldn't have been a bad dream. The Duke grabbed Anneliese by the wrist and said she was absolutely right. Leaning in close and looking her straight in the eye, Helmut added that she'd saved him from a nightmare. She didn't get what he meant and figured he was talking about saving the water demons. Anneliese suddenly sneezed. Touching her hand, the Duke asked how long she'd been outside, worried she might be freezing. The heroine smiled and replied that they should probably head back. Helmut took off his cloak and told her to put it around her shoulders. And even though she said it wasn't far to her room, he insisted that it was cold in the hallway too. And when Anneliese finally gave in, she felt so comfortable from the warmth of his body that lingered on the cloak. The Duke smiled and said she could keep wearing it if she wanted. Looking at Helmut, she thought about how much softer and warmer he'd become towards her since they first met. Back in her room, Anneliese realized the Duke's ribbon was still in her hair. She smiled, wondering if she could keep that too. If Florence's story ends well this time around, there won't be any need for a villainess. Until that day, Anneliese planned to live peacefully in the Weissman Duchy. A few days passed, and it was raining in the duchy from early in the morning, when suddenly a carriage pulled up to the castle. Meanwhile, she was having a good time, admiring Ortho's talent for braiding amazing hairstyles. Schlert informed his lord that a package had arrived for him from the capital. Helmut called Anneliese over to give her a pearl necklace, a gift from the water spirits. She marveled at how beautiful it was, and the Duke asked her to turn around so he could help put it on. Anneliese's cheeks flushed from how close the man was. Ortho remarked that the necklace really suited her, and the hairstyle they chose was perfect. He suggested that Anneliese go to the water spirits to show them the necklace. The Duke was struck by how happy she was with such an inexpensive necklace, as if she weren't a count's daughter at all. He asked if Anneliese wanted anything else, because he was ready to grant her any request. She, in turn, was surprised that he showed her a side of himself that only close people see, because it turned out he was tough on the outside, but kind and gentle inside. She smiled and replied shyly that she was happy with such a simple gift. The fact that the children gave her these pearls, and Helmut made them into a necklace, already made the gift special to her. Turns out, besides the package from the capital, there was also a letter. The Duke figured it was a message from his uncle. They'd been talking about buying up land around the lake, but the seal on the envelope didn't belong to His Majesty. It was from the Privy Council. It was a warning letter, saying the council had received word that Duke Weissman and his fiancée had interfered with Prince Klaus's special hunt. Both the Duke and his fiancée were now considered persons of interest by higher authorities. Therefore, an audience with, and any contact with, His Majesty was now forbidden to both of them. Besides the Duke, Count Neumann received the same warning letter. He was furious that his daughter had dragged the family name through the mud and decided to bring her home ASAP and set her straight. Helmut was sure that if he could just talk to his uncle, he'd understand, but the council cut off their communication. The problem was, now they couldn't even talk, and now, because they disobeyed Prince Klaus, the Duke is suspected of plotting a rebellion with the Neumann family. The heroine understood how alarmed the council must be at the possibility of a conspiracy between people like the infamous Count, his villainous daughter, and a creepy Duke with a bad rep. It hurt her to realize how much trouble she was bringing to those who were helping her so much. So Anneliese, hanging her head, apologized to Helmut for getting him mixed up in this mess because of her. However, the man replied that it didn't matter at all. And although the girl tried to convince him otherwise, the Duke was sure that everything would definitely work out. He asked her not to think about it, since he wasn't exactly close to the people from the capital anyway. The Duke declared that he had plenty of allies, because he had the forest demons, Schlert, and Ortho on his side. And if Anneliese was by his side too, then he wouldn't need anyone else. Hearing these words, the heroine's heart skipped a beat with joy that she had become a friend to him. The Duke said she had nothing to worry about. He'd write to the Privy Council and negotiate, because he wasn't about to kill innocent forest people. Still, no matter how much he tried to reassure her, she felt guilty and couldn't look on the bright side. Suspecting the Emperor's relative of treason was a serious charge, and being involved with her only made his already tarnished reputation worse. Things could only go downhill from here. If this place gets attacked, everyone living here will be arrested. Anneliese wasn't sure if she should even stay in the duchy. Her being here was just making everything worse. Before she could really think about it, a loud banging echoed at the gates that evening. Schlert went to see who was visiting the castle at this hour. It was Count Neumann, standing at the gate, furious and demanding to see his daughter immediately. The heroine was incredibly surprised to see her father in the drawing room. The Count sat in an armchair, arms crossed, and announced he'd come to talk to Anneliese about her engagement. Dad told her to pack her bags and get her butt home, ASAP. So, Anneliese thought she was engaged to the Duke, but they never actually made it official. The Count was humiliated that his daughter defied the prince and got blacklisted by the secret council. So, he decided she'd marry a Marcus, one of his business partners. Neumann already gave the thumbs up. He said that if Anneliese married someone from another country, it would throw everyone off her trail. And honestly, she just wanted to lay low for 6 months, thinking she'd be safe far from the capital. She didn't even consider a fiancé from another country, even though that would have been the perfect play from the start. Anneliese suddenly realized that if she just dropped off Klaus's radar, everyone could go back to their normal lives. She had 6 months left, and her parents' place was the only place she could turn to. The heroine realized she didn't have any reason to say no to her father's offer, so she agreed and said she'd pack her things in a few days. The Count announced he'd get a carriage ready for his daughter, and she left the living room. But the second she closed the door behind her, the Duke was waiting in the hallway, asking what she'd been talking about with the Count. She didn't answer, so he asked Anneliese again what she was planning to do. Forcing a smile, she told him she had good news. She could finally leave the country, and there wouldn't be any more issues with Klaus. She went on about how everything would be fine. She wouldn't cause the Duke any more trouble, and it would be better for everyone that way. But Helmut cut her off, saying there would only be problems if she left. When she tried to argue, insisting that things would only get worse if she stayed, he grabbed her arm. Frowning and without a word, the Duke silently started pulling Anneliese somewhere. Spotting Schlert on the way, he ordered him to tell the coachman to get the carriage ready for a guest's departure. The heroine had no clue where he was dragging her, but Helmut kept his mouth shut. Soon they were on the second floor of the mansion, in the Duke's room, a place Anneliese had never been before. Even though it was pouring rain, the guy went to the balcony door and threw it open. Then, he told her to come over and look down, saying you could see everything way better from there. Peeking out, Anneliese saw her father's carriage pulling away from the castle grounds. In the distance, you could see the capital and even the symbol of this world, the World Tree. Out of nowhere, Helmut announced that Anneliese could use this room. The heroine didn't get why she'd need to use his bedroom. And then the Duke explained to the girl that this room used to belong to his mother. Even after being exiled, Helga never stopped thinking about the people and their lives, and she said that looking at the capital from here eased her soul. After laying that out, Helmut asked Annalise if she missed the capital. He figured she was uncomfortable living in the castle and missed her folks. That's why she wanted to leave. The heroine lowered her head because the truth was, she didn't want to go at all. She replied that she'd forced herself on him as his bride, messed things up with the prince, and the duke was only suffering because of her. Helmut glanced at her, not seeing what the big deal was, even if that were the case. Annalise confessed her fear that people might hate her. Her whole life had been filled with that fear, so she'd always done whatever pleased others. She kept putting her own life on hold and did everything just so people would like her. In response, the duke reminded her of what he'd said that morning, that he didn't care if people hated him. But still, he was curious why it bothered Annalise so much. And then the girl replied that she wasn't bothered by Klaus's dislike, nor by the hurtful words of strangers. Tears streamed down Annalise's face, and she confessed to Helmut that her only fear was that one day he would come to hate her. In both worlds, there were and are people the heroine never wanted to let down. Sobbing, she said that she was nothing but trouble, and because of that, one day the duke would want to get rid of her. Helmut reached out to the girl, pulled her close, and hugged her tightly. He reminded her that he himself had offered her to stay in the duchy. He said her past reasons were clear to him from the start, but since things had turned out this way, he had a new proposition for her. Gently stroking Annalise's cheek and looking into her eyes, he asked if she would actually agree to marry him. For a moment, the heroine was speechless when she heard those words from him. Surprised, she exclaimed that she couldn't do that, since they had only agreed on 6 months. She said again that she'd just be a burden to him, and she didn't want that. Helmut, amazed she still didn't get that he'd changed his mind, hugged her again. It surprised him how a girl who was usually so brave could be so scared sometimes. Pressing his cheek against Annalise's, he told her not to worry about anything and promised to protect her. The girl thought the duke was so kind. It was like he was the main character in a game. That thought made her laugh, and she told Helmut he was too good. She was blown away that he was willing to marry her, just to help her out. She tried to explain to the duke that this wasn't the same as giving someone a necklace. Helmut touched the necklace around her neck with his finger and stood like that for a while, lost in thought. Then he suddenly pulled Annalise close and kissed her. His lips brushed her cheek softly, so close to her own. After that, Helmut declared he'd never give something like that out of pity. The duke smirked and asked if he should give her a ring instead. The heroine just stood there, totally thrown, not understanding what he was doing. She couldn't believe it and asked if he realized that this would be an actual marriage. Helmut smiled and replied that it all depended on her and she could have anything she wanted. He wanted to know who Annalise would choose, him or some stranger her father picked out for her. The girl didn't understand what had suddenly happened to someone whose affection level was in the negatives on day 1. She got curious about what his affection was now, and she carefully looked at where the scale should be. To her surprise, she saw that the affection level was completely maxed out at 100%. While she was trying to process everything, Helmut suggested she come inside so she wouldn't freeze. But Annalise didn't want to go in. Even with the heavy rain, she was burning up, trying to figure out when this happened and if the duke was really in love with her. Meanwhile, Klaus arrived to meet with Florence, immediately apologizing for being late. The prince explained that he had an important guest and was held up a bit. He said Count Neumann came with news that he'd decided to marry his daughter off to someone from a neighboring country, so the count wanted the warning letter withdrawn. Klaus was sure that if Annalise left the country, everything would be fine, and he was doing it all for Florence. Noble women passing through the garden at that moment greeted His Highness. Florence overheard them talking about her, calling her a simpleton. She was supposed to be Annalise's victim, and everyone was supposed to pity and love her. Florencia needed that villainess out in the open, 'cause that's how she was gonna shine. And here she is again, playing her favorite Otome game, Celestial Marriage. It's the story of how the heroine saves the world and gets loved by everyone. But only one of the 3 love interests can make her dreams come true, and then she becomes the country's savior. She needs to pick one of them to keep playing, but for some reason, all the options are locked. She's getting pissed, poking at the screen, trying to figure out what's going on. And then it hits her. She's not the heroine, she's Annalise, the main villain who gets offed at the end of the game. The thought of no one loving her brings tears to her eyes. It feels like she's falling into the abyss, drifting down like a feather, but suddenly someone catches her. She opens her eyes and finds herself in the Duke's arms. He smiles, promising to protect her, saying she has nothing to worry about. When Annalise opened her eyes, she realized it was just a dream. Guess she's still shaken up from yesterday, seeing him even in her sleep. The Duke's affection meter and his question about who she'd choose kept replaying in her head. I mean, picking between a familiar hottie and some random dude? No brainer. But now, because of her, Helmet's suspected of conspiracy, and she's just making things worse by being around. Still, the thought of leaving him gave her a real gut punch, even though she couldn't figure out why. Ortho poked his head into Annalise's room to ask what kind of juice she wanted for breakfast. The kid freaked out seeing her sprawled on the bed in a weird position. Thinking Lady Annalise was feeling faint, Ortho rushed over to see how he could help. She said she was just spacing out, but the kid already felt her forehead and knew she had a fever. Without wasting a second, he bolted out of the room to grab everything she needed. She thanked him and slumped onto the floor, wondering when she could have caught a cold. After struggling back onto the bed, she figured this was actually for the best, since she was too embarrassed to go out and face the Duke. After that kiss yesterday, she had no clue what to say to him or how to act. No one had ever treated her like this before, and it totally scrambled her brain. Even though Schlert thought going into town at this hour was a bad idea, the Duke ignored his advice. Florence had asked to meet him, and she was already standing there, apologizing for bothering him. She said she needed to tell Mr. Wiseman something, but asked him not to mention it to Annalise. Florence pointed out that their last conversation didn't go so well, and she'd love a do-over. The Duke shot her a look of pure ice and asked what she wanted. Florence reminded him she was chosen as the Moon Maiden and confessed no one had ever been so cold to her before. On top of that, she called herself the main character of this world, the one Prince Klaus and everyone else is crazy about. The girl had no doubt that this world should be exactly the way she wanted it to be. And even though the Duke was floored by her arrogance, Florence said that wasn't it at all. According to her, she just wanted to make everyone happy, because that's the role of a saint. Besides, she wanted to know what the Duke himself wanted. Florence was ready to grant any wish he had, from a position in the Empire to expanding his territories. She offered him to forget Annalise, follow her, and only then, she claimed, would peace come to the land. The girl had no doubt that Mr. Wiseman was thrown for a loop by the letter from the Secret Council. Florence was dead certain that if things kept going the way they were, the Duke could get straight up banished. But since that wasn't in the script, she blamed Annalise for everything, again. The girl was convinced Neumann was cooking up something big, wanting to trash the happy ending this world was supposed to have. And according to Florence, the Duke was just another pawn in Annalise's wicked scheme. Meanwhile, back at the castle, the heroine got out of bed to wash a glass. She still looked pretty rough, and Ortho told her she should get back under the covers. When she asked where the Duke and his grandpa were, he said they were out on business. Annalise felt lonely having to sleep on such a bright, sunny day. And even though she was no stranger to feeling alone, she'd gotten used to hanging out with everyone in the dukedom. Hearing that, Ortho was touched and promised the Duke and his grandpa would be back soon, and until then, he'd keep her company. The kid tucked the lady into bed and started reading her a book while she was just thinking about how much she'd come to love this place. It hasn't been long at all, and she's already hoping everyone gets back home soon. Meanwhile, the Duke was still stuck in that meeting with Florence. After listening to her, he asked why Annalise didn't have a place in her happy ending. Without waiting for her answer, he guessed it was just because Florence had cast her as the villain. The girl replied that in this story, everyone bands together to defeat the evil that Annalise represents, and that's how it's always been. However, the Duke told Florence he wasn't going to be a part of her scheme, even if she was the Moon Maiden. The girl called Helmet weird because she thought she was the heroine that everyone in the world adored. She was genuinely confused about why he was acting that way towards her. Remembering that Florence had asked him what he wanted, the Duke stated that he wanted equality in this country. And if she's planning to mess with Annalise and the demons, that's a flat-out pipe dream. As far as Helmet's concerned, Florence is the real villain here, and he told her exactly that. The Duke wrapped it up by saying the only thing he wants from her is for her to stay out of his way. Florence had heard Weissman was a weird dude, but this was on a whole other level. But once she was alone, it hit her. This world needs a hero who ain't gonna back down from evil. Florence suddenly realized it wasn't just about Annalise, and her goal should be to wipe out evil wherever it rears its ugly head. And to do that, she needed to start by taking out this Duke. Ortho burst into Annalise's room, stoked to tell her that the master was back. The girl clapped her hands over his mouth, quick, and told him to keep it down. But it was too late to shut him up, because Helmet was already standing in the doorway, wondering why she was out of bed with a fever. The heroine was flustered, blushed, and started mumbling like she'd forgotten how to talk. Seeing her like that, Ortho figured the lady's fever had spiked again. The Duke smiled and suggested she rest up until the weekend. He announced he'd arranged for Annalise to go home for the weekend, but if she wasn't feeling better, he'd send a messenger. The heroine thanked him, even though she really didn't want to take her father up on the offer, and clearly wanted to marry Helmut. The Duke asked Annalise how she was feeling, and said he was going shopping again tomorrow if she needed anything. That's when Ortho suddenly tried to talk him out of it, arguing that the lady was lonely without him. The heroine got embarrassed and rushed to explain that she wasn't just talking about the Duke, and that she was talking about meals in general. Helmut decided to stay at the castle tomorrow, told Annalise to call him if she needed anything, and left the room. Ortho, meanwhile, ran off to help his grandpa cook dinner. After being alone for a bit, she realized she was actually relieved the Duke was staying home tomorrow. She didn't get what was happening to her. It was awkward being around him, but she also didn't want to be apart. Out of nowhere, Helmut suddenly came back and asked if Annalise had a minute. He was wondering if she really told Ortho she'd been feeling lonely. She blushed and admitted that she did get kinda bummed when he and her grandpa were gone. The Duke smiled, 'cause it sounded like she missed him too. Annalise's cheeks got even redder as she said, "Yeah, I guess so." But then, catching herself, she added that it didn't mean anything deep, and even though she couldn't quite say it out loud yet, she was seriously happy he was back. As Annalise got ready to go down for dinner, she was thinking about how much she wanted to get to know the Duke better. She wanted to learn more about him, even though maybe she should have been figuring herself out first. This girl always did what everyone else told her, and wasn't used to relying on anyone. It was all getting way too complicated, because she really didn't want to drag anyone else into Annalise's messed up story, but the thought of what would happen if she accepted the Duke's offer. When she came down for dinner, Ortho, all innocent, started gushing about how amazing her dress looked. For a second, Annalise even wondered if she was overdressed for a regular dinner. Seeing the Duke smile, she hoped he didn't think she'd dolled herself up just for him. Suddenly, Ortho piped up, asking if they were going on a date, embarrassing her even more. Even though Annalise immediately said no, Helmut suggested they take a walk after lunch, since the weather was so nice. Since she wanted to talk to the Duke anyway, she agreed to the walk. Strolling through the woods after lunch, Helmut asked Annalise what she wanted to talk about. His smile was so damn charming in that moment, the girl just blanked on his question. Helmut's gentle smile and smooth voice got her heart racing like crazy. He didn't come across as some scary dude anymore, not like before. Annalise originally thought he was a total jerk, but he turned out to be a good guy, and that's what really clicked for her. Finally getting her act together, she asked the Duke why he wanted to marry her. Helmut answered that she didn't hate his eye, and as a human, she didn't turn away from the demons in need, but helped them. He didn't bother answering the prince then, figured it was pointless, but he liked her answer, and it was even better that the Shadow Council noticed them. According to the Duke, Annalise messed with the so-called order of this world. Still, she didn't think she'd done anything special, 'cause anyone in her shoes would have done the same thing. Helmut's mom loved his demon dad, and the Duke knew damn well that honest, accepting people are rare as hell, but they're out there. And Annalise definitely wasn't the only one who was so open. Helmut added that, even so, he'd met her, and that was enough for him. No matter how much people praised her, she never had any self-confidence, and she could never really believe those words. But one thing she knew for sure was that meeting the Duke changed everything. Maybe down the line, she'd meet someone else, and that relationship might not be perfect either. But in that moment, for Annalise, there was no one who could even compare to Helmut. The girl was trying to figure out if this meant she was falling for him. Lost in thought, Annalise tripped on a root sticking out of the ground and bumped right into the Duke's shoulder. She apologized, and Helmut, smiling without a word, just pulled her close. Then, he told her how his mom used to say he'd meet someone someday who wouldn't be scared of his eye. Back in the day, Helmut had to skip town because of this whole mess, but lately, all this alone time's been getting to him. And it all started when Annalise walked into his life. The Duke looked her straight in the eye and confessed he wanted her to stay. The heroine, for her part, admitted she wanted to get to know him better and asked if she could ask about his mother too. Helmut smiled and happily agreed to answer her questions. She loved seeing him smile, and maybe she was imagining things, but it seemed like he only laughed when she was around, and that made her happy. She'd always felt alone, and her whole life had been lived in fear of being rejected. She just wanted to be loved, but that meant putting on a show and trying to please everyone. She tried so hard, but nobody ever noticed. When you think about it, she'd never been honest with anyone. She just craved affection. The heroine had always longed to hear words like the ones the Duke had just spoken, confessing his desire for her to stay. Annalise realized that when she was with Helmut, the whole world around her transformed. The girl blushed and was about to share her own thoughts with the Duke, but at that moment, he suddenly seemed to sense something and spun around. In the part of the forest he was looking at, a pillar of smoke rose above the trees. The western village was engulfed in flames. and the locals were in a panic. A monster had suddenly appeared there, destroying everything in its path. One of the villagers grabbed the elder, who was in shock from the fire, and urged everyone to flee to the mountains immediately. From a tree, the yellow bird of Florence watched what was happening. Upon learning about the monster's invasion of the western village, the prince was very surprised. He knew these creatures usually only came out at night, but this happened in broad daylight. Klaus couldn't figure out why, since that's exactly why the locals put up barriers every night. Florence guessed that someone had deliberately lured the monster there. With her usual innocent smile, she reminded the prince that rumor had it there was someone in the country who could control monsters. Florence had no doubt Klaus knew exactly who she was talking about. The duke stood on one of the towers of his castle, gazing into the distance. Schlert approached him to get an update and learned the smoke had already died down. He reminded his lord that fires in the forest and mountains were a pretty common occurrence. However, Helmut pointed out that it wasn't the dry season, and besides, there was a village in that direction. Meanwhile, Anneliese was in her room, lost in thought about the overwhelming happiness she felt at that moment. In the game, the heroine was Sweet Florence, making everyone happy and soaking up the praise. That's why she was always happy. But with Anneliese, things were totally different. She became the happiest person alive from just a few words from one guy. Even though that character's fate was a total downer, Helmut was right about leaving not being the answer. And if she was only thinking about surviving before, now she's actually dreaming about the future. Truth is, she really wants to stay here in the duchy. But then she started wondering how she could make that happen, what she needed to do. It's like the duke's fallen for her, even though they haven't even, really kissed. And she definitely wants to. Suddenly, she realized that if she doesn't return his feelings, nothing's gonna move forward. Right then, as Anneliese was wandering down the hall, lost in thought, she ran into Helmut. She figured it was her moment, time to confess and plant one on him. But looking at the duke, her resolve just melted away. She was way too embarrassed to go through with it. Noticing the weird look on her face, Helmut asked if Anneliese was feeling all right. Not even knowing what she was saying, she just gave this dumb little laugh and said she was just hungry after her walk. The duke smiled and told her to just let him know if there was anything she liked to eat. Looking at him, she thought, even though she sucked at talking, at least she made him smile. And if all she wanted from the duke was to be saved at first, now everything was different. Anneliese was happy that Helmut was smiling at her, and she really wanted to get those feelings across to him. But she had no freaking clue how to do it. She wasn't sure if she should ask again if he really wanted to marry her. There was no doubt that Anneliese had to make the first move. But right now, she just couldn't bring herself to do it. The girl decided she'd confess to Helmut as soon as she mustered the courage and resolve. For now, she just wanted to be near him like this, even for a little longer. But suddenly, there was a clatter of footsteps outside the door, and the duke jumped up, wondering who could be showing up at his castle at this hour. The door burst open with a crash, and imperial guards appeared on the threshold. In that very moment, the heroine regretted missing her chance to confess to Helmut and let him know how she felt. Because the senior commander was already reading the order to Duke Weissman. He was to be taken into custody and brought to trial for the, misconduct in the western village and creating a disturbance for the locals. The guy said a monster attacked West Village earlier today. Anneliese jumped to defend Helmut, not seeing how any of this could be tied to the duke, who'd been at the castle all day. The commander took the girl's words as a sign she might be in on it. Helmut kept his cool, but was still surprised, since he thought monsters only came out at night. One of the knights snapped at the duke, telling him to cut the crap, since he was the one controlling that beast. Helmut glared at him with such fury in his yellow eye that the guy instantly shut up and backed off. The duke stood up, saying he wanted to talk to his uncle and the secret council anyway. Schlert voiced his concern for his master, but one of the soldiers elbowed him in the neck and told him to stay out of the way. Seeing his grandpa get hurt, Ortho rushed to help him. When the guard noticed his pointy ears, they were convinced the rumors about the duke keeping monsters at his place were true. One of the young knights even suggested we just get rid of them. And when Ortho tried to argue they were family, not monsters, the guy told him to shut his mouth and kicked him hard. Anneliese watched everything in silence, trying to figure out what the hell was wrong with everyone. What she saw was unforgivable, and she wished she could just vaporize them all with her power. The heroine was ready to act. She raised her hand and yelled for them to stop. But the duke, as if guessing what she was planning, stopped Anneliese. He smiled, asked her to look after the house, and promised to be back soon. The heroine knew perfectly well that Helmut could have fought them off, but he didn't, which meant he was definitely up to something. And since Anneliese couldn't do anything, all they could do was wait and hope for the best. After Helmut was taken away, Schlert remembered those guys mentioning a trial and figured the master would be held at the courthouse near the castle. Ortho was stoked. If this was really happening, the Duke could talk to the Emperor and straighten everything out. But the heroine wasn't feeling it. Something about this whole thing just felt off. Meanwhile, Elgar got word that they caught the Duke. And get this, he was surprisingly calm, didn't seem scared of the trial at all. The knight shot a quick glance at Klaus and Franz, standing a little ways away. The prince ordered the Imperial Guard commander to escort him to Helmet. The guy was confused. The Duke was supposed to be held at the courthouse. But to keep things quiet, they had a mage put him under. None of those three wanted this to go to trial. They'd already decided the Duke was going to meet his end right then and there. When Helmet came to, he found himself on a cold, damp floor in a cell. He couldn't figure out why he was there. He was supposed to be taken to the courthouse. When the Duke tried to get up, he found his leg was shackled. He smirked, noting they'd come prepared. Helmet sat motionless by the bars when suddenly a man's voice called out to him from outside. A moment later, the court wizard Franz appeared by the cell, a wide smile lighting up his face. He announced that he'd taken Wiseman's magic power last night and put him to sleep. Franz chuckled and asked if the Duke had slept well. Helmet's strength was truly gone, and if he could have transformed into a beast, he would have easily torn apart these bars and shackles. But the Duke noticed a small window in the room and thought that when the moon appeared at night, he could regain his strength. Helmet saw no point in talking to the prince and his cronies. He expected the court would help resolve all the misunderstandings, but it turned out to be a trap. All the Duke wanted to know was where he was, but Franz was ordered to keep his mouth shut. His only job was to watch the prisoner, and if he resisted, to keep draining his magic. So, the mage strongly suggested Helmet play nice. Florence was feeling a real rush from the Duke's arrest. She even thought being the bad guy instead of Annalise was pretty sweet. Just as she was chuckling to herself, sitting on the steps, Klaus came up behind her to see if she was all right. He knew Florence was from the village the monster attacked, and was just glad no one got hurt. She jumped up and threw herself, sobbing, into Klaus's arms, complaining about how sad she was. Truth was, she wouldn't have minded if someone in the village had gotten hurt, but this worked out okay too. Pretending to just realize she was clinging to His Highness, Florence abruptly pulled away, apologizing profusely. The prince told her the monster was alone this time, and the squad managed to take it down. But if the village had been any further from the capital, people definitely would have died. Klaus said if they stall on the trial, they won't be able to protect anyone. So, as the crown prince, he decided to get rid of the Duke, just like anything else messing with Florence. Looking her straight in the eye, he promised the Duke would be dealt with, no trial needed. Florence asked if he could really pull that off, since Lord Wiseman was the Emperor's nephew. Even the prince couldn't punish him for that incident at East Lake. But Klaus said this was different, because the safety of the people comes first. He said wizards and knights can't control monsters. Only the half-demon Duke can. A flicker of common sense hit the prince, and he wondered, what was the point of attacking the village in the first place? Florence couldn't let that thought take root, though. So, she grabbed Klaus's hand, and in this almost hypnotic voice, told him that you don't need to understand the bad guys. Smiling, she assured the prince that all that mattered was that he was on the side of justice and had to take those villains down. After that, Klaus couldn't think about anything except the villains he had to deal with. The Duke's room felt way too big without him. It was up on the very top floor of the palace, so you could even see the capital city from there. Feels like just yesterday she and Helmet were admiring that view together. Annalise stood on the balcony, wondering what she'd do if they didn't let him go. If he didn't come back, she regretted not hugging him back when he embraced her. And when he mentioned getting engaged, she should have just said yes right then and there. All Annalise had to do was tell him how safe she felt when he was around. She should have said it all, but she kept missing her chance because she was too shy. The heroine regretted her silence so much that tears started streaming down her face. From here, you could see the most amazing view of her favorite game world. And even though the weather was nice, Annalise cherished those rainy days with Helmet even more. The girl suddenly realized that even though this was a game world, she wasn't the main character. The right choice wasn't just going to appear, no matter how long Annalise waited, so she had to start thinking and acting for herself. The heroine ran up to Grandpa Schlert and asked him if he knew when the trial was. The girl decided to go to the hearing and make sure the Duke came home. Even though the capital was full of enemies, and she was told to wait in the castle, Annalise knew that as long as she stayed put, the story wouldn't move forward. When Lady Neumann's carriage pulled up to the courthouse, the knights tried to turn her away, saying she wasn't getting in. Even though the guards knew she wielded dark magic, they were ordered to let no one pass. The heroine stepped out of the carriage, demanding to speak to someone in charge, but one of the knights tried to stop her. pointing his sword at her. The girl lightly touched the weapon and said she understood perfectly well that he was just doing his job. The next moment, the guy was horrified to find that his sword was nothing but a charred, twisted piece of junk. After that, Annalise repeated her demand to call someone she could talk to. While waiting for someone to come out, the heroine thought about how she needed to keep herself in check, since the Duke was only on her side, and she was only on his. Finally, Elgar came out to the girl, having already been informed that she wanted to be present at the trial. Annalise insisted on it, because she feared false accusations being made against the Duke. Elgar told her not to push his buttons, and remarked that, as usual, the bad guys only have sympathy for other bad guys. He told Neumann there wouldn't be a trial, and the Duke would be punished soon. The heroine froze, realizing it had all been a setup. Elgar told her not to look at him like that, adding that without this measure, they wouldn't get justice. Annalise couldn't believe they decided to execute Helmut like this, without a trial. So this world was making the Duke the villain instead of her, and she had to stop it. The girl declared that the monster attack on the village had nothing to do with Weissman. She insisted that they needed evidence for accusations like that, and this kind of vigilante justice was just unacceptable. And then Elgar told her that trials were only for aristocrats. That kind of treatment of commoners wasn't unusual, and in this extreme situation, it applied to the Duke too. Annalise couldn't believe that ordinary people got punished, even if they were falsely accused. Elgar, though, he didn't have a single doubt that they were called to punish those who'd strayed from the path. And even though the girl tried to argue, saying people's lives were way more important, he laid out what their priorities really were. According to him, those priorities were the whole reason their empire's capital was so damn beautiful. Klaus and the Moon Maiden were different, sure, but otherwise, what's the big deal if there's one more or less person in the country? Clenching her fist, Annalise snapped back that all that meant was it wouldn't affect their lives, specifically. As far as she was concerned, Elgar was the only one who didn't get what priorities meant here. It was just like with those water demons, right? These people weren't thinking about them, or the locals, just the main characters who lived in this world. Annalise said it really bummed her out, because she thought Elgar was fighting for what's right. The knight replied she was right, because in his eyes, keeping the country strong was what's right. The heroine remembered Helmut saying he could see the wicked intentions in people. When someone's convinced they're doing the right thing, they don't see anything wrong with it. And with Elgar, it was clear he was dead certain he was being just. So Annalise said she understood, and that they obviously weren't going to see eye to eye. Still, she could help the Duke with force if she had to. Elgar just smirked at that, saying she wouldn't get anywhere, since Helmut wasn't in the courthouse or the castle. The prince planned to execute the Duke tonight, and no matter how hard Annalise searched, she'd be too late. Back when Schlert was talking about where they were holding the Duke, she'd felt like something was off, but then Annalise remembered something and burst out laughing. Her sudden laughter pissed Elgar off. He couldn't figure out what she found so funny. But she just ran up to him and thanked him for the chat, because now she knew exactly where the Duke was. With a smirk, she touched the knight's surprised face, already apologizing that things weren't going to go the way they wanted. Helmut sat on the floor of his cell, staring out the window, seeing that night had already fallen. Franz was sitting on a chair near the cell, dozing off without a care in the world. The Duke knew this sorcerer was no joke, especially since he managed to steal all his magical power. Helmut closed his eyes and heard the rustling of the trees, which meant it was a windy night. The moon should be coming out soon, and the Duke was planning to, even if just a little, regain his strength and deal with Franz. And if that didn't work, he wanted to wait for the prince and try to force his way to freedom. Either way, Helmut needed to wait, either for the moon to rise or for them to open the cage. But suddenly, Florence appeared in the dungeon, and as if reading his mind, asked if he was waiting for the moon. The girl smirked and declared that, unfortunately, the Duke wouldn't be seeing it tonight. Word on the street is Mr. Klaus is showing up any minute, and then Helmut's going to be taken care of. Florence squeezed out a tear, real dramatic, like she actually felt bad for the poor Duke. But then she grinned and said everyone would finally be able to breathe easy, because the bad guy had to get what was coming to him, so everyone else could live in peace. Helmut, cool as ice, asked Florence what she was doing there. The girl apologized for disturbing him, and, reminding him she was chosen as the Moon Maiden, told the Duke he should confess his sins. Franz thought it was pretty big of her to want to bless someone with light before they, With that, the wizard headed upstairs to give them some privacy. Alone with Florence, Helmut told her he wasn't confessing anything. But the girl just laughed and said she only came to have a little chat. She told the Duke that Annalise had been hanging around the courthouse. Helmut jumped, every nerve on high alert, as Florence started talking about how that poor girl had wanted to see him. Florence thought their little newlywed game had gone way too far. It was weird how the background characters were suddenly front and center, so they needed to be taken care of. That's why they locked the Duke up somewhere nobody would ever suspect a member of the royal family could be held. Florence kept rambling about how everyone was looking for Helmut, but he couldn't take it anymore and told her to shut her yap. The Duke was stunned by the audacity of this girl, who'd lured him into a trap and now dared to mock him. But Florence couldn't hide how thrilled she was with the new storyline. The Duke, jealous of the prince, unleashed a monster and attacked innocent people. But then, despite the danger, the saint stepped in. And then, together with her beloved Klaus, the Moon Maiden defeated the villain. Florence was super happy with how the story was going, because facing off against the Dark Duke and his monsters was way more interesting than just executing the rival villainess. That's when the prince showed up in the dungeon, saying we shouldn't even talk to someone who doesn't regret their awful deeds. He apologized for being late and started unlocking the lock to get this over with ASAP. Klaus didn't bring any backup, which meant Helmut had a shot at snatching his sword. But Florence suddenly stopped the prince, saying the Duke looked pretty strong and dangerous. She suggested doing things differently and focused her magic on the bars. The powerful energy wave sent Helmut flying into the wall, where he smacked his head. Suddenly, his vision went blurry, and he felt like he could barely see. Meanwhile, Klaus had already drawn his sword to execute the Duke right there to cleanse the country. The Duke backed up against the wall, which was suddenly swallowed by darkness. Turns out, Anneliese was standing outside the dungeon at the window, ready to rescue Helmut with her magic. In a flash, the wall crumbled, and the Duke fell right into the heroine's arms. An hour earlier, Schlert, who'd brought Anneliese to the capital, was scratching his head, wondering why she was just walking away from the courthouse. He was positive the Duke was being held somewhere inside, but she told him that wasn't the case at all, and that Helmut was in the dungeon. Schlert couldn't believe it. His lord was His Majesty's nephew. They couldn't treat him like that. But Anneliese was rock solid in her conviction that the Duke was being held in the East Dungeon. Anneliese's fate, to be taken out, had been transferred to Helmut Weissmann. In the original story, the villainess was locked up in the East Dungeon. Because of that, even her own father couldn't find and rescue her. And if Helmut wasn't in the courthouse, then he had to be there, no question. Close to where they needed to be, the heroine asked Schlert to ditch the carriage and continue on foot, quietly. Watching from behind the trees, they spotted His Highness's carriage pulling up to the dungeon. The Anneliese thing went down at a different time and place, but Klaus was mixed up in that too. The heroine whispered to Schlert to hurry up, and they headed towards the dungeon. The girl realized she could easily bust through the wall with dark magic, but the building had multiple floors, and she had no clue where they were holding the Duke. Anneliese wanted to believe he was okay, but the villain's demise was a real game-changer in this story. She was desperate to make sure Helmut was all right, so she decided to check the ground floor windows first. Schlert happily pointed out there was a forest nearby, which was a stroke of luck for them. The old man used his magic to ask the forest for help. The light that lit up the wall showed that the Duke was underground. The heroine couldn't believe nature was siding with the demons, who were supposed to be under human control. Then, right before the shocked eyes of Klaus and Florence, Helmut found himself in Anneliese's arms. She hugged him tight, thanking God the Duke was okay, and he returned the embrace. When Helmut stood up, leaning on Anneliese, she noticed something was wrong with his eye. The Duke told her not to worry, explaining he'd been temporarily blinded, but his sight would return soon. Franz rushed over, drawn by the noise, wanting to know what had happened while he was gone. Klaus yelled that it was game over for the bad guys, despite their attempt to screw things up. Anneliese, who was ready to use her magic again, suddenly cried out, like she was in pain. The prince admitted the girl's magic wasn't half bad, but Franz was able to shut it down. He accused the villains of daring to stand against the Empire's best swordsman, a powerful mage, and the Moon Maiden. Klaus said they were totally drained of magic, so they had zero chance of winning. Meanwhile, 3 locals were heading home after a long day at work. After saying goodbye to his buddies, one of them barely took a few steps when he spotted a huge clawed paw in the bushes to his right. A massive, terrifying monster with a flaming head was bearing down on the guy. The heroine realized how dumb it was not to consider they'd steal her magic and not bring any weapons. Now she couldn't use her powers. And to top it off, the Duke's eye was totally blind. Standing in Helmut's arms, she wondered how they were ever going to escape this dungeon. Suddenly, the Duke pulled the girl even closer and whispered that she had saved him again. Anneliese didn't understand what he was talking about since she hadn't saved him yet, even though she definitely intended to get him out of there. Helmut pressed his lips to her temple and whispered that everything was all right. 5 minutes would be enough, and he just needed to buy some time. Klaus demanded they spill the beans about what they were whispering about. He announced they were trapped, surrounded by guards outside the dungeon. The prince warned that even if they somehow escaped, they'd be branded fugitives and hunted down. Franz backed Klaus up, telling the Duke and the girl to cut the crap and surrender. Florence, who'd been silent until now, suddenly spoke up, repeating that Anneliese was the villain of this world, which meant she was the bad seed. Nothing but trouble, someone to hate, and totally unloved. Florence said there's no way she'd ever want to live a life where everyone despised her. But then she added that the two villains had nothing to worry about because they had a vital role to play in this world. They were both destined to be defeated by the main character, the Moon Maiden. Taking a hard look at Florence, Helmut suggested that, following her logic, anyone could end up being the bad guy. He couldn't picture himself or Anneliese in that role, so the Moon Maiden's words didn't sting. Still, he forbade Florence from calling his bride hateful or someone unloved. According to Helmut, Anneliese, unlike him, saw the good in the Moon Maiden. Florence sighed and said she didn't get what the Duke was on about. Taking the prince by the arm, she suggested he drop it and finish what he started. Franz's hand went to the hilt of his sword. The Duke pulled Anneliese close, and she whispered to him with a smile that everything was all right. Helmut looked at the girl, surprised, as she turned and suddenly started talking to Florence. She reminded the Moon Maiden how she'd said earlier she couldn't live if she were hated, and called her a lightweight. Anneliese's feelings weren't hurt by her words anymore, and the general hate didn't bother her either. As long as she had the people she cared about by her side, nothing else mattered. So, if Florence wanted this so badly, Anneliese was ready to play the villain. Smirking, the heroine added that she'd be the kind of villain you just can't take down. Helmut whispered that she nailed it, and the timing was perfect, because the moon was already coming up. And even though Anneliese knew the Duke's powers would return with the moonrise, she had no clue how they'd get out of there. But right then, Helmut called out loudly for his assistant, Schlert. The demon was perched in a tree near the prison, and he called on the power of nature for help. The tree reached its branches through the prison window and grabbed the heroes. Before Florence knew what was happening, it snatched the Duke and Anneliese and lifted them high above the ground. In a flash, they were at a height the guards below couldn't reach. Helmut asked Anneliese if she was totally okay, because it would have been enough for him to just take the fall. Even though everything felt like a dream, she finally realized it was all really happening. She hugged the Duke tight, admitting that more than being hated by others, she feared losing him. Tears streamed down Anneliese's face at the thought of what she'd do if she couldn't see Helmut anymore. She stroked his face, and looking him straight in the eyes, confessed how terrified those thoughts made her. Then, she pulled Helmut's face close and gently touched her lips to his forehead. The Duke couldn't believe what was happening, and all he could manage to say was her name. Feeling his touch soothe her, Anneliese suddenly leaned in and kissed Helmut on the lips. After the kiss, she giggled shyly, glad he couldn't see her face at that moment, or she'd have died of embarrassment. She suggested they run away as soon as his sight returned, but the Duke suddenly confessed that he could already see. Turns out, he'd regained his power as soon as he got outside. Flustered, Anneliese hid her face behind a nearby branch, trying to avoid looking Helmut in the eye. The guy smiled, saying he'd ask about her reasons later, and promised he wouldn't go anywhere and would protect her. The next instant, as soon as the moon crested the mountains, the Duke's shirt started ripping at the seams, and his teeth turned into sharp fangs. Right in front of the knights standing below, Helmut transformed into a wild beast. The soldiers were so scared, they couldn't even hold on to their weapons in their trembling hands. Franz decided to use his magic to drain the Duke's power and calm him down. But the sorcerer couldn't do anything, because his magic circle shattered into pieces. Franz had to admit to the prince that he couldn't do a thing, because Helmut was just too powerful. The magic circle couldn't handle it. It was powerless against the strength of the moonlight. Anneliese stroked Helmut's long mane as he growled, and declared that they weren't Beauty and the Beast, but a demon and a villainess. And there's no way the guys down there could take them, unless they just straight up surrendered. Nobody even suspected that Florence had already sent her messenger bird, Tururu, to the monster-infested slopes. Soaring over the monsters, the bird put a hex on them, all so her mistress could finally win this fight. Standing under the tree, staring at Anneliese, Florence was just thinking it was high time this wicked witch kicked the bucket. Just then, the guard rushed up to the prince to deliver some urgent news. They were shouting that disaster had struck, and monsters had shown up in the capital. The beasts weren't just there, but in several villages at the same time. The Imperial Guard warriors couldn't handle them all. Seeing everyone below scrambling, the heroine tried to figure out what they were talking about. Helmut told her that monsters had appeared all over the country, and the warriors were no match for them. Saying they were out of time and needed to hurry, The Duke scooped the girl up in his massive paws and took a leap. Franz noticed they were escaping and rushed to tell Klaus about it. Meanwhile, the knights were waiting for His Highness's orders on what to do with the monsters and the locals. Klaus was totally lost and couldn't get his head straight. Blazing through the forest, Helmut told Anneliese he thought that whole thing back in West Village felt kind of fishy. He was sure someone deliberately sicked those valley monsters on them. The Duke suddenly stopped and let out a deafening roar that echoed all around. At that very instant, the monsters that had just been attacking the villagers suddenly turned and started crawling in one direction. The knights, led by Elgar, stood there wide-eyed, totally clueless about what was going on. Before long, a huge number of monsters had gathered in front of the Duke. Helmut was like a freaking beacon, drawing all those monsters in. Once all the creeps were gathered, the Duke told Anneliese it was her time to shine. He grabbed her hand and asked if her powers were back, now that the sorcerer's magic circle was busted. With all those people around, Helmut suggested Anneliese show him the power they were so afraid of. His plan was for her to save their bacon with her magic. Anneliese's dark magic could, really mess things up, even living things. But she knew it could be used for good, and it was time to prove it. Reaching out her hand, she asked if these monsters were really bad news. The Duke said they came from the northern valleys and could mimic life, but that didn't matter. So, he put his arm around Anneliese and told her not to sweat it. Right in front of everyone, the heroine started wiping out those monsters, one by one. When they were all gone, the crowd went wild, cheering and totally blown away. Now they knew dark magic could actually get rid of monsters. One of those things would have taken like 10 nights, but she handled it in seconds. Elgar was stunned, watching the locals rush to thank Lady Neumann for saving them. The very next day, the story had already spread all over the capital. People were seriously impressed by Anneliese's dark magic, some even saying her power might be more reliable than the Moon Maiden's. Klaus was seething, convinced Weissman and Neumann had set the whole thing up. He was sure the Duke summoned the monsters on purpose, just so Anneliese could publicly destroy them. Elgar doubted that, since Helmut was locked up when the monsters showed up. We already saw a monster pop up during the day, which pretty much screams that their life cycle's messed up. Elgar didn't think the Duke was behind it, and the prince was totally clueless about what was going on with him. Klaus wasn't budging from his position, though. He was convinced the Duke and Anneliese were just pulling strings to win over the public. Meanwhile, back at the Duke's castle, Ortho burst into the ladies' room to get her for breakfast. It took a while to calm the kid down after last night's situation. Things got so hectic that Anneliese and the Duke never got a chance to talk. Actually, Helmut asked her to come to his room later, but she never showed. She felt super awkward after yesterday's sudden confession and kiss and didn't know how to face him. But blowing him off completely would be a bad look, so Anneliese decided to tell the Duke she just crashed hard. Deciding that's what she'd do, the heroine threw open the doors, ready to wash up before breakfast. But Helmut was already standing on the threshold, and he looked dead serious. The Duke was holding her breakfast on a tray and asked why she hadn't come to him last night. The heroine decided to stick to her original plan and said she'd fallen asleep way too fast. And even though she hoped Helmut wouldn't be mad, things seemed to be going in a totally different direction. Anneliese was lost, not knowing what to do, and hoping for help from Orto, but the kid just stood there, nervously looking back and forth. The Duke walked into the room without a word, and she started making excuses. She kept saying it wasn't that she didn't want to come. Finally, Anneliese got brave and blurted out that she was just afraid of getting grilled about yesterday and didn't know how to face him. Taking advantage of the moment, Helmut asked her point blank if she was sure she should have said what she did yesterday. And since Anneliese didn't get what he was talking about, he reminded her how she told Florence she'd turn to the dark side. The Duke had a plan to protect them both, but for her, it meant cutting ties with her whole family. Helmut stopped talking mid-sentence, noticing Anneliese standing in the middle of the room with a really weird look on her face. When he asked what was up, she admitted she thought he was going to ask her about when she laid one on him. Awkward silence filled the room. But then she finally pulled herself together and said Helmut didn't need to worry about her family, because her dad was a real piece of work. She said she didn't have any feelings left for her family or Florence. She cut herself off, blushing hard. The Duke leaned in, smiling, and asked if he understood correctly that she'd been thinking about him all night. His words made Anneliese, already embarrassed, blush even harder. She told Helmut to quit embarrassing her and dove for the bed, trying to hide from him under the covers. The Duke followed her and stood in the bedroom doorway for a moment, smiling gently at the girl curled up in a ball. Then, Helmut knelt beside Anneliese and asked her to come out, saying he felt he'd waited long enough. The heroine didn't have a response to that, so she finally peeked out from under the blanket. When she looked at Helmut, She was relieved to see he was smiling. Annalise decided to check if he was still upset with her. To the heroine's surprise, the Duke replied that he wasn't even thinking of being upset. Only now did the girl suddenly realize that this strong, big man wasn't angry, just pouting at her. Annalise hugged him, thinking how lucky she was that he could pout, laugh, and that she could make him smile. And then she reminded Helmut how he'd promised to give her anything she wanted. And after that, she finally got the courage to admit that her only wish was for him to always be by her side. Helmut smiled, promised Annalise that he would be, and gently kissed her hand. Then he pulled her close, and their lips met in a kiss. In that moment, in his arms, she felt unbelievably happy. She thought no one would ever love her, and she could only admire other people's happy stories. Annalise laughed and told the Duke that she felt happier than any fairy tale princess. Helmut pulled her down onto the bed, and she asked what method of protection he'd been talking about earlier. Annalise knew the whole country would be watching them now, and she worried the Duke might face some serious heat. But Helmut explained that he'd been isolated since birth and never could connect with people who hated demons. On the other hand, he always got along with demons just fine. Even though he was only half demon, that was just a straight-up fact. The Duke knew that after his mother died, his uncle didn't know what to do with him. He wanted Weissman to act like royalty, but he just couldn't live up to the expectation. That's exactly why Helmut decided it was time to pick a side. The Duke was destined to take the Demon King's throne. His father was respected by the people, and his magic was so off the charts, he was stronger than anyone. But right now, the demons had no king. They could only hide in fear of humans, and their lives were getting worse every year. The demons were waiting for Helmut to inherit his father's place and become a shield between them and the humans. However, the Duke doubted that Annalise would agree to the prospect of living in a nation made up only of demons. Yet, against all odds, the girl squealed that it sounded totally awesome. She thinks Helmut would be the perfect king. Sure, he might seem scary at first, but he's actually a big softie. Annalise was convinced he'd make a fantastic king. But before asking the emperor for independence for his lands, the Duke needed to deal with those monsters. He had to figure out why they went ballistic last time. What exactly set them off? If they leave things as they are, the capital and its people will be in danger. Helmut figured it was all the work of whoever was controlling that creature that showed up in West Village the other day. Monsters don't have brains or intelligence, and you can't reason with them unless you're talking about the cry of a spirit bird. Annalise suddenly froze when she heard about the bird. Meanwhile, that very spirit bird flew to the feet of its mistress, who was hiding behind the castle wall. From there, Florence was eavesdropping on Klaus and Franz, hearing how opinions on the Duke and Annalise were completely split. Some people were grateful they were saved, others feared their power, but the mage admitted he was definitely in the first group. Even though Klaus was ticked off by that, Franz was sure their army couldn't have handled that many monsters. Listening to them, Florence was thinking things should have gone down completely differently, and now it looked like she was the bad guy. The heroine wondered how the Duke, being a lion, managed to gather all those monsters in the first place. Helmut told her he wasn't a lion at all. No matter how much she begged him to explain what that meant, the Duke just said she'd understand eventually. With that, he suddenly crashed out, and Annalise never got answers to any of her million questions. She sadly thought that maybe he hadn't slept last night because of her. The heroine admired the sleeping Duke's long eyelashes, thinking that this character wasn't even in her favorite game. She'd always thought of Annalise as the villain, but now she suddenly wondered what she was really like. Annalise had dark magic powers off the charts. She could wipe out humans and demon beasts like it was nothing. And still, she died like the bad guy, even though she didn't hurt anyone, not even when they were offing her. She was just playing her part, a poor sap taken out just to keep the story on track. That character wasn't even allowed to want you to live, but our girl decided that wasn't going to happen to her. Fine, she'll be the villain, so what? Good and evil are just a matter of perspective anyway. She decided to fight to the bitter end, because His Highness promised to protect her. So Annalise really wanted to protect him too. Meanwhile, Franz was still arguing with Klaus, saying if the monster attacks happen again, they'll have nobody to rely on but the Duke and Lady Neumann. They had to face the fact that getting rid of those two wouldn't be a walk in the park. Clenching his fists in anger and helplessness, the prince replied that maybe, just maybe, there was a point to that. He walked away, head hung low, not even noticing Florence standing behind the wall. The girl called out to Klaus and told him not to get discouraged, but the prince just stood there, not turning around, like he didn't even hear her, lost in his own thoughts. All he could think about was how he'd failed to solve the problem his people had brought to him. Klaus couldn't figure out how he thought getting rid of Helmut and Annalise would bring peace to the country. Since the prince wasn't turning around, Florence stepped closer and told him he couldn't let guys like them win. She reminded Klaus that he himself blamed Helmut for everything, and it was unforgivable that he put the people in danger and deceived everyone. The prince agreed with her, thinking the most unforgivable thing was that the Duke let monsters into the human settlement. Suddenly, he spun around, grabbed Florence by the shoulders like a madman, and begged her to lend him her power. With that power, Klaus wanted to set the country on the right path. The girl, stunned at first, quickly composed herself, smiled, and gently touched the prince's hand. In her mesmerizing voice, she started telling him everything was fine, and as the crown prince, he just needed to support the Moon Maiden. Florence asked him to leave everything to her and just do as she said. But against all expectations, her charm somehow didn't work on Klaus, and he refused, saying this wouldn't fly. The girl tensed up, not understanding what was happening to him and why he was reacting the wrong way. But Klaus insisted that as the crown prince, he had a responsibility to govern the country, and he needed power to do that. Florence tried to pull the same old trick again and asked in a suggestive voice if he wouldn't listen to her. The prince froze for a moment and refused once again. The thing was, Klaus was clearly a noble character who put the country's prosperity above all else, so he couldn't compromise on anything that went against it. Florence suddenly thought that sicking demonic creatures on them might have been a bit much. The girl decided to switch gears, saying she misspoke and asking him to trust her. According to her, all she really meant was that they should join forces and make the prince's dream come true together. Klaus's eyes lit up with hope that the Moon Maiden would choose him and carry his wish to the World Tree. Florence promised him that, saying that no one was more worthy than His Highness. Once every 300 years, the World Tree chose the one called the Holy Moon Maiden and a pure-hearted person to be its guardian. Together, with the help of a spirit bird, they would obtain the flower of wishes that bloomed at its very top. And when the World Tree granted their wish, it would fall asleep again for the next 300 years. Anneliese couldn't shake the Duke's words about how only the voice of the spirit bird could control the demonic creatures. She remembered the guide from the game Celestial Marriage, the bird Tururu. Florence always carried it around, and at the climax of the story, it transformed into a sacred spirit bird. If Tururu was the spirit bird of this world that Helmut mentioned, then she's the one who could summon the monsters. Catching Anneliese in the hallway, the Duke asked her why she looked so down in the dumps. He gently stroked the girl's face and asked if she wanted any sweets. The heroine melted at his touch, thinking she didn't need sweets when she had him. The Duke confessed he was planning to ask his uncle for independence and wanted to hear Anneliese's thoughts on the matter. Helmut didn't know exactly what Klaus had reported to the Emperor, so he was prepared to cut ties with both his uncle and the country. The heroine thought the Duke must be sad to break all ties, since he had a pretty good relationship with His Majesty. Noticing the girl's worried gaze on him, Helmut stated that she had nothing to worry about. The heroine flinched, shocked that he knew she was worried about the Emperor. Learning who she was actually worried about, the Duke smirked. Then, Helmut added that Anneliese was always worrying about others. He said that it was her, but he cut himself off, leaving what exactly unsaid. The girl thought the Duke had wanted to say it was her sweet nature. Since it embarrassed her, Helmut concluded that Anneliese seemed to finally be learning to read his mind. The girl suddenly caught herself thinking it was weird, but being around the Duke made her feel like she was becoming a caring and sweet main character. Helmut was planning to tell his uncle that they didn't intend to break off diplomatic relations, and their goal was to draw a line so people wouldn't attack the demons. As far as he knew, his father, the Demon King, used to stop the monsters that attacked from the valley. So, if they became like a shield, the Emperor would hardly be against their independence. Helmut told Anneliese about the rumors that after that night of monster cleanup, some people were ready to side with them. It was only natural for those who were in danger, and the Duke didn't mind people living on their side if there were any who wanted to. Listening to him, Anneliese couldn't believe the world, where Florence had always been the main character, was actually starting to change. The girl thought about how she and the Duke were strong enough to handle this, and they would get through it. Even if they get called the bad guys, they won't give up, and they won't let themselves get taken down. Still, Anneliese was worried about the possibility of dragging the people of this country into it and having them turn against them in the end. The girl couldn't figure out what would happen to the ending of this story then. According to the original, Florence and the one she chooses will take their wish to the World Tree, and then there'll be a happy ending. Their support from the people will become rock solid, and they'll be loved and praised for ages. Anneliese suddenly realized that she'd unintentionally stolen the people's approval from the heroes. She could entertain the idea that she and the Duke might survive, but she didn't know if they could still reach that happy ending after all this. Noticing that the girl was worried about something, the Duke pulled her close and asked her about it. He told Annalise to speak up if anything felt off. Then she said the World Tree ritual was happening real soon. She figured if it all went smoothly, things would finally get sorted out. The Duke double-checked, asking if he understood correctly, that once the Moon Maiden actually became the savior and got massive support, things would calm down. Annalise admitted she was glad to have allies, but she didn't want to stir up any unnecessary trouble. She just wanted to live a peaceful life, and that was enough for her. The Duke replied that all the more reason to go and let everyone know they weren't trying to take over the country. He decided to ask his uncle for an audience and submit a formal request early next week. Helmut also added that Annalise would be going with him. She agreed, just hoping that for the next 6 months, until the end, His Excellency and the demons wouldn't get hurt. The Duke leaned in, reached for her, and kissed her softly on the lips. Then he grinned and said they'd have to tell his uncle they were planning to make things official. Right then, it hit her. A peaceful life with Helmut was looking pretty unlikely. A few days went by, and she headed down to the carriage, ready to go to the palace. The Duke was planning to create a haven for demons and take the proposal to His Majesty the Emperor. Plus, he had to announce their official engagement, so at least on the surface, if she and the Duke could just bow out of this whole thing, maybe everything would be okay. But as the carriage neared the capital, Schlert suddenly slammed on the brakes. A ton of soldiers were blocking the entrance to the city, cutting off their path. The Duke just chuckled, figuring they'd try to make things difficult right up to the very end. Annalise peeked out of the carriage and noticed Franz was leading the squad. That surprised her, since the mage wasn't exactly a frontline fighter like Klaus or Elgar. When she and Helmut got out of the carriage, Franz announced they'd been expecting them. He promised to escort them to the castle and asked them to trust their safety to him. Both the Duke and Annalise were totally thrown, not understanding what was going on. Helmut asked Franz if they were planning something fishy, but he denied it. He said that after she and Annalise took down those monsters, half the city was on their side now. They were being treated almost like heroes, even bypassing the Moon Maiden's authority. Franz explained that in this situation, they couldn't just attack outright, or they'd look like the bad guys. Getting into the carriage they'd prepared, the Duke reminded the mage how recently he'd tried to, remove him from the picture. Annalise told him to cut the sarcasm, seeing as they'd managed to get to the castle without any trouble. Franz pointed out that Neumann was giving off a totally different vibe than before. He used to think she was a real villain, but now things felt different. The heroine sighed, knowing that to keep the happy ending intact, she had to play the villain just enough and make sure the Moon Maiden won everyone over. So, she told the sorcerer that she was the villain. Still, Helmut was sure that even if half the people were on their side, Franz still didn't think much of them. Annalise knew that the sorcerer was one of the main characters in this game, and he was just following the script, nothing more. Franz replied that he agreed with Klaus, since he was just following orders from the castle. His words surprised the heroine, and she asked why he said that, since he should have had his own dream. In the original story, Franz was one of the candidates for the throne. He was a character from a poor family, hired by the castle when they spotted his magical talent. The heroine knew all this, so she asked Franz if his dream wasn't to teach magic to poor kids, help the sick, and save lives. Once Annalise realized she'd spilled the beans, it was too late. To weasel her way out of it, she claimed she knew because she was a villain and wouldn't advise going up against them and the Duke. But she whispered to Helmut that she'd learned it in the capital, because if she admitted it was knowledge from the game, they'd think she was nuts. It was pretty obvious that in this version of the story, Florence was probably after Klaus, so she told Franz that if he stayed a court magician, he wouldn't be able to achieve his dream. The guy's eyes lit up when she asked if he was really okay with that, but then the girl laughed and added that it was probably pointless to say that to him. Franz hung his head, and you could tell he was really thinking hard about what she'd said. Suddenly, it occurred to the heroine that her dark magic might also be able to help people with illnesses. The girl said she wanted to try cleaning up only the areas hit by the disease. Listening to her, Franz wondered if this was all just some villainess's game to trick him. All the way there, he couldn't shake the feeling that even if it was a trick, something still didn't quite add up. As Annalise got out of the carriage, she bumped her head on the roof and yelped. Franz's first instinct was to reach out a hand and ask if she was okay. Only a moment later, did he suddenly realize he was doing something wrong, offering help to a villainess. Before the mage could come to his senses, the Duke's strong hand pushed him aside. He forbade Franz from touching Annalise so roughly and sharply that he immediately backed off and apologized. The heroine started defending the mage, explaining to the Duke that he was just being kind and wanted to help. She asked Helmut not to act like such a jerk, because he was totally different and really nice back at the estate. Still, Franz couldn't picture the Duke as a good guy. Just looking at him scared the crap out of people. Then he noticed Helmut's smile as he looked at Anneliese, and how his eyes actually sparkled with kindness in that moment. The heroine turned to the stunned Franz and told him that she and the Duke were planning to create a demon country. She excitedly explained that the purpose of their visit was to discuss this with His Majesty the Emperor. The sorcerer was shocked yet again, because up until that moment, he thought they were after power over the entire country. The girl smiled and added that, even though it's a demon country, His Grace believes humans could live there too, if they wanted. And although she didn't think Franz would be into it, if life for people in his homeland didn't improve, they could come to their country. According to her, they could help each other with food, build schools. Finally, she added that Franz himself could do whatever he wanted in this country. The sorcerer couldn't understand why she was telling him, of all people, his enemy, all of this. The heroine just smiled and said she wanted everyone's dreams to come true. As the Duke and Anneliese entered the palace, he smirked, saying her villain act didn't even last a minute. It just hit her that he was right, and she'd been trying so hard to keep a straight face. Then, Anneliese realized that when they got out of the carriage, the Duke was deliberately acting intimidating. But Helmut replied that he just didn't appreciate Franz putting his hands on her. With that, he kissed her hand, and she was touched by the little jealous display, just like in her favorite autumn game. Anneliese admitted that if it had been someone she didn't like, she could have been way harsher herself, but Franz wasn't nobility, and in her opinion, he seemed like he was up to no good. That's exactly why the heroine thought this guy would understand them. Helmut pulled her close, hugged her, and told her to be careful with how nice she is. Anneliese pushed him away, telling him not to do that in front of His Majesty, that it made her uncomfortable. When Franz got back from escorting them, one of the knights rushed up to him, wanting to know how the Duke and his companion were doing. And when the guy asked him to report everything to Master Klaus ASAP, the mage suddenly snapped at him. The knight was taken aback by that reaction, and an awkward silence hung in the air. Pulling himself together, Franz apologized for his outburst, thanked the guy, and told him he was actually on his way to see the prince. Anneliese's words kept replaying in the mage's head about whether he was happy with his position as court mage. Franz knew the moon tree only granted the wish of one person, chosen by the moon maiden. It made sense that Florence would pick Klaus for that role, since he's the crown prince, and she's always right. The mage was thinking about how what they were trying to achieve was way more important than his own dream. But he kept replaying Anneliese's last words in his head, over and over. He couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, everyone's dreams could actually come true. Meanwhile, Duke Weissman and Countess Neumann entered the throne room for an audience with the Emperor. His Majesty greeted them with a smile, and Sir Elgar stood beside him. The Emperor was genuinely happy to see his nephew and took a step toward him with open arms. But for some reason, Elgar stepped between them, shielding the Emperor. The knight declared that even as His Majesty's relative, the Duke was still a dangerous individual, suspected of treason. Elgar was determined to protect the Emperor and his country. He accused the Duke and Anneliese of plotting against the Empire. The heroine remembered the exact moment he could have twisted her words. She started explaining that she meant she would stand up to the accusations against the Duke, not the Empire itself. The Emperor decided to get involved. He thanked Elgar for his loyalty, but asked him to go a little easier on his nephew. The knight bowed obediently to His Majesty. Ever since the Emperor took the throne during peacetime, the country hadn't seen any more wars. Plus, he cared about his sister's son and definitely showed him some love. Word had already reached the Emperor that Helmut had become pretty popular with the people after he and Miss Newman wiped out those monsters that popped up in the city. They also told him that they'd taken down creatures that all the Imperial soldiers combined couldn't have handled, and they did it in a snap. Helmut asked his uncle if he'd also heard about those who weren't exactly thrilled to have such a protector around. The Emperor admitted that, as an uncle, he'd been worried about the Duke always being cooped up in his border castle, and he was glad to hear he was helping people. He figured it was all thanks to Miss Newman. And now, looking at his nephew's face, the Emperor realized he should be even more grateful to that girl. Seizing the opportunity, Helmut told his uncle that Anneliese had officially accepted his engagement proposal. The Emperor thought this was fantastic news, and couldn't understand why his nephew looked so gloomy delivering it. Then the Duke declared he intended to leave the country with Anneliese, and wanted the lands surrounding his castle to do it. The Emperor was floored by the news that his nephew was planning to give up his status as a Duke of the Empire. He was saddened to hear it, because he thought of them as one family, who should support each other and live together. The heroine was struck by how genuinely kind the Emperor actually was. She thought that maybe they shouldn't have made such a big decision all alone, without talking to him first. Maybe if they'd thought it through more carefully, they could have found another way. Annalise glanced at the Duke, but the Emperor suddenly continued his impassioned speech. He declared that Helmut shouldn't be ashamed of his mixed heritage. Since the Duke proved he can actually be a benefit to the people, if he puts his mind to it, the Emperor's willing to guarantee his place in the Empire. He offered his nephew the position of general, saying the current one's about to retire. Elgar flinched when he heard that, and a shiver ran down his spine. Meanwhile, the Emperor kept insisting that the bad rumors about Helmut were only because he's a recluse, and if he took a position serving to protect the country, the people would accept him. He assured his precious nephew that he was a worthy man and should have confidence in himself. Now the heroine understood. The Emperor wasn't acknowledging the Duke's demonic blood, and he even offered him the general's position. In the original story, that job was Elgar's biggest dream. This knight, who honed his swordsmanship to the highest level, inspired fear even in neighboring countries, and brought an end to an era of war. After that, he spread fencing as a method of spiritual refinement for knights, and his wish was realized in a peaceful and orderly world. The heroine apologized and interrupted the Emperor, asking him to let her speak. She claimed no one could replicate Helmut's power, and the same went for her dark magic. But when it comes to the general's actual job, she thinks the role's better suited to someone who can train the troops and boost overall combat effectiveness. Then, out of nowhere, she adds that a guy like Sir Elgar, standing right behind the Emperor, would be perfect for the position. The knight was pissed that some count's daughter dared to voice her opinion to His Majesty like that. The Emperor looked at the young man with surprise, hearing him yell at Annalise to know her place. Elgar just lost it. He hadn't even told Klaus about wanting to be a general. Right now, he was just a guard with limited combat experience. He had nothing going for him, and he didn't understand how this woman could do something like this. But the Emperor still listened to her words, and noted that Elgar's loyalty was truly exceptional. His Majesty had heard from Klaus more than once how much he trusted this knight. Elgar lowered his head and said he wasn't worthy of such praise. That's when Helmut stepped up and told the Emperor that this knight was straight up, no BS. This wasn't some trick to get ahead. He genuinely believed what he was saying. The Emperor thanked his nephew, because he knew damn well the Duke had a knack for reading people. His Majesty said Helmut even busted a corrupt minister back when he was a kid. The Emperor would be thrilled if his nephew stayed at the castle. Didn't matter what position he took, and the Duke's eye really could spot bad intentions. That's how he saw that Elgar, just like in the game, sincerely believed in justice. The Emperor declared that Annalise was right, and personal strength alone wasn't enough to make a commander. He suggested the knight start training with his men, to see if he had what it takes to lead. The Emperor thought that someone like Elgar might just be the kind of guy he could trust completely, like his right-hand man. Leaving the hall, the heroine was stoked that they'd managed to get through the conversation with His Majesty okay. The Duke was still a little tense, though, because even though the Emperor hadn't denied them independence, there was a catch. He started by mentioning that his older sister was just as stubborn, and that's how Helmut ended up being born. Realizing his nephew got his stubbornness from his mother, he didn't try to talk him out of it. However, the Empire was at the 300-year mark, and the Emperor wanted to avoid anything that might give the impression of disunity. So, he asked them to wait until the day of the World Tree ritual. It wasn't long until that day, or the finale of Marriage in the Heavens. Crown Prince Klaus's desire was for the country to prosper, which meant when the World Tree fulfilled his wish, there would be a happy ending. And the villainous Annalise was just supposed to be background noise, and when it was all over, she and the Duke would leave the country. The heroine was thinking about how they would just live happily together after that. Her thoughts were interrupted by Helmut's question, who suddenly wondered why Annalise hadn't participated in the selection for the role of the Moon Maiden. The World Tree's supposed to grant the wish of someone with a pure heart. The Duke thinks Annalise would be the best Moon Maiden, since she always wishes happiness for others. The girl laughed bashfully, saying she was sure Klaus would be chosen as the Moon Maiden this time, and he, in turn, wholeheartedly wishes for the country's prosperity, so Annalise didn't see anything wrong with it. But Helmut suddenly wondered if the country's prosperity was really that valuable. He asked her if it was really more valuable than an individual person's life. And suddenly, the heroine started to understand something about this world where innocent demons were being used as enemies. The Emperor, instead of supporting the half-blood Duke, just gave him lip service about how things were fine. There are a ton of problems the main characters are choosing to ignore, and just wishing for the country to do well might not be enough to save everyone from suffering. The girl wondered if, instead of just walking away and cutting herself off from everything, maybe she could actually do something. Suddenly, The Duke grabbed Annalise's hand and pulled her close. Before she could even figure out what was happening, he gestured for her to look behind them. The heroine turned and saw Florence standing at the end of the hallway. The girl's eyes were blazing with fury in the darkness. Florence, fists clenched with rage, demanded to know how Annalise dared show her face so brazenly in the castle. She wanted to know what the villainess was, plotting this time, and accused her of wanting to tear everything down. Annalise suddenly realized that, from the main character's perspective, maybe she was right. The villainess, who was supposed to die, is fighting back, causing trouble, and has secretly won the people over. Annalise sincerely apologized to Florence for how things had turned out, but she just didn't want to end up, gone. She confessed that she didn't care about any kind of fame, and just wanted to live her own life. All she wanted at first was to survive, and not just be some background extra for the main character. Florence suddenly got spooked, not understanding what was happening with Annalise, and yelled at her to stay away. But the girl still got closer, trying to get across that everyone wants to be happy, even if they're not the main attraction. No matter how much Florence struggled, Annalise grabbed her hand. She told the girl that this world is way bigger than she even realizes. Florence finally managed to break free. She smirked and told Annalise not to play the victim, like she's being forced into something. Florence said she was pathetic for not realizing yet that she and the Duke needed to disappear. The girl's eyes were wild, saying that she, the main character, and Klaus, would save this world, because only they were right. Florence was determined to make Annalise understand that all her struggling was pointless. So, at the next World Tree ritual, she decided to pray that she and the Duke would just vanish. The heroine was horrified because the World Tree's power was absolute, and it could grant any wish. Pulling herself together, she declared that even if Florence did that, it wouldn't change a thing. Besides, Annalise asked what would happen to Klaus's dream if the Moon Maiden changed her wish. And even though Florence figured her rival was begging for mercy, Annalise explained she was just trying to get through to her, that this wouldn't benefit anyone. Nevertheless, the Moon Maiden was unwavering in her belief that getting rid of the villainess would be good for the whole world. She told Annalise to just accept it, confident that Klaus would understand, since he always did whatever she told him to. On top of that, only the heroine, who commanded the spirit bird, could convey a wish to the World Tree. Already standing by the carriage, the heroine still couldn't wrap her head around how someone could use the World Tree's power not for good, but to wipe them out. The Duke stated he had a thought or two about that woman and her bird, but to do that, Helmut needed to ask Annalise something. He wanted to know why she'd recommended that knight for the general's post today. The same went for her eagerness to help the mage with his dream, and it seemed like Annalise knew way too much about them. Leaning over her, Helmut declared that if she wanted to use his power, then he wanted to know everything about her. The girl realized she'd said too much, stuff she knew because of the game. Trying to justify herself, she claimed she'd recommended Elgar simply because she genuinely thought it was a good idea. Helmut asked, why, flatly, and from his face she could tell he was getting angry. Maybe because her behavior seemed so weird, the Duke figured she was keeping secrets, even from him. But she didn't know how to explain to him that this world was a game she'd played in another world, and that's why she knew the characters. It wasn't like she was hiding it on purpose, but she had no clue how to even begin to explain it. Ever since she got stuck in this world, she's always tried to be real with her feelings and keep it 100. Annalise, head down, said it bummed her out that he didn't trust her. She just didn't know how to explain herself. The wind picked up, and Helmut headed to the carriage, suggesting they talk inside. The girl knew her weird behavior had the Duke all kinds of worried. She probably should have spilled the beans about being from another world sooner. His Grace definitely would have heard her out. But once they were in the carriage, Helmut just straight up pulled Annalise onto his lap. Seeing the confusion on her face, he asked with a smile if she was uncomfortable. Then, he put his hand on her head and pulled her close to his chest. After that, Helmut asked Annalise again why she recommended that knight for the general's position. The heroine confessed that she actually knew about Elgar's dream of becoming a general. She was about to explain how she knew, but the Duke just cut her off, saying it didn't matter. All he wanted to know was why she'd put in a good word for this guy with his majesty. He figured Annalise shouldn't have even gotten involved, especially not bring it up right in front of him. Leaning in close, Helmut asked her what would happen if Elgar fell for her. Then he suddenly turned away, saying that he was already smitten, just like that sorcerer. Annalise gasped and begged him to stop talking like that. She was positive that neither Elgar nor Franz could possibly be interested in her. Then she suddenly sighed in relief, admitting she thought he was upset because she hadn't told him about things that happened before they met. But the Duke wasn't even thinking about that. He only cared about what Annalise was thinking right now, standing in front of him. He wanted to know everything about it and be the only man on her mind. With the promise that he'd do absolutely anything for her, Helmut kissed the heroine. But Annalise didn't even need to be asked. Her heart was already overflowing with thoughts of the Duke. It blew her mind that he was jealous of Elgar and everyone else. Guess there are things you just don't get until you say them out loud. Things that bug you, even when you think you've got it all figured out. If you want to be loved, you can't just sit around waiting. You gotta make the first move yourself. And since our girl decided she was gonna be real with herself in this world, she followed Helmut out onto the balcony and gave him a big hug. Annalise told him she didn't want him suspecting her anymore, or for her to be afraid of him, so she wanted him to know everything about her. She asked the Duke to listen to her story about who she was before she came here. She knew it was a crazy story, but confessed that she wasn't Annalise. She came from another world and somehow became her. She told him how she passed away and ended up in the world of a game she used to play. The Duke just calmly asked if she'd been hit with a body swap curse. She couldn't believe he wasn't even surprised, and that stuff like that was even a thing. Then she confessed that swapping bodies wasn't even what she really wanted to talk about. She explained that in her past life, she never stood up for herself and always bent over backwards for everyone else. Never said no to a favor, hoping that would be enough for people to appreciate and love her. But she didn't do anything for herself, just bottled up all her resentment. The people around her weren't bad, and if she'd tried to fit in, maybe things would have been different. Becoming Annalise, she became a different person and decided to say whatever was on her mind, even if it seemed selfish. She suddenly realized why the phrase different person freaked her out so much, because if she was still the old her, the Duke probably wouldn't have fallen for her. Nervously clenching her fingers, she worried that Helmut must be totally bummed out. But then he just blurts out that it's actually a good thing she's got no ties to her past, because it'd be a real pain if she had friends or family she couldn't leave behind. Now they could bail on this country without any extra baggage. Plus, even though Annalise was claiming to be a different person, to Helmut, everything she said just sounded like the story of the same girl. And even though she insisted it couldn't be, he reminded her that she'd never once acted selfishly for her own sake. According to Helmut, that desire to help others was the real her. Sure, some people out there might not appreciate it, but others will. It doesn't always just boil down to specific actions. Still, the girl believed that who she was then and who she is now were totally different people. The Duke suddenly asked Annalise if he'd acted like a jerk when he first met her. He confessed that he used to be suspicious of everyone, but seeing her changed his mind. Helmut said her past wasn't the whole story, because who she is now is just as real. She'd never really thought about it, but in any form, she just wanted to help people. The guy standing in front of her was giving her more than just the words she wanted to hear. Being with him even made her like herself. Helmut touched her face and told her she should actually be a little selfish. He asked if there was anything she wanted, promising to grant any selfish desire she had. She thought about it, but couldn't come up with anything right away. She admitted that just having him by her side seemed like enough. The Duke was struck by how even those words came straight from Annalise's heart. He asked if she'd listen to his wish then, and she said she'd happily do anything he wanted. Then Helmut pulled her close and asked again if she was really ready for anything.